Hello, my fellow Westorians. Welcome back to History of Westeros podcast. We got a big one today. Before the dragons, it's a topic that allows us to use a lot of imagination, a lot of figuring out, a lot of triangulating. It's not an explicitly covered topic in any of the source material. It's something we just are able to guesstimate and, like I said, triangulate. We know a lot of these characters that we're going to talk about. We're aware of them in their later lives, so we have some inkling of what type of person they were, which now allows us to, discuss or guess or theorize what they were like when they were a little bit younger. And that's a lot of fun. We've got a lot of regions to cover, and we got to cover the reactions and state of affairs between the different kingdoms. So we'll see what transpires today with all that, with all this large amount of information. It's a little different kind of topic than we normally do. There's not going to be pretty much any real world comparisons today. I don't really have much for that. There may be some things that come up. Maybe some of y'all will realize things that are good real world comparisons. After all, Westeros is a bit of a parallel to real world England. Aegon the Conqueror to William the Conqueror. So there's probably some things there. But we're not really focused on the conquest. We're focused on the time period 5 to 15 years before that. And that's pretty cool. Sean, what do you have to drink today to go along with that? Do you have some sort of 7 drinks mixed to one, or one drink to... That would be kind of cool. 7
I should
ingredients.
have.
That'd be neat, yeah.
Although... it makes as much sense to have 8 ingredients.
You could argue for 8. Yeah, you're right.
Or 9? I don't know.
7, 8, or 9. There's an argument for all 3. But not 6. I was gonna no way.
Yeah. 5 is right.
5 is right. Perfect use of Monty Python joke.
I was going to say today might be one where I prompt a lot more questions than answer questions. Even some of this stuff that I should know. I read it one time, but I haven't really learned it yet. I don't have context for everything. I might mix some stuff up. So maybe the more average viewer out there will appreciate my perspective here.
Indeed. I may take some things for granted. I think that's a very valuable thing you bring to the table here for the show. Sometimes I assume people know things, and that's not always going to be true. So that helps.
To answer your question, no. This is the Rainbow Naked Drink with the new Mango Mountain Dew.
Mango Dew.
With the Watermelon Bang.
Okay. That's only 3 things. Oh, my goodness. Mm-hmm. See? 3 is also right out. Go back into the kitchen and make another drink. Shout out to our friend Nina. As always, very helpful with the notes. Check out goodqueenalley.tumblr.com. That's 1 L in alley. The latest blog post is discussing trial by combat and what happens, where is the line, right? It's supposedly anyone who is knighted cannot be denied a trial by combat, but there's got to be some circumstances where they're just so obviously guilty that they don't get a trial by combat, like you're the traitor on a losing side of a war. I mean, you just had a trial by combat. It was the war you just lost, right? So there's got to be a line somewhere, but we don't really know what it is. So this is what she takes some guesses on, some educated guesses, and looks for examples throughout the books to make that case. It's a good question and a good answer. Also want to give a shout out to our friend and frequent guest, Stephen Atwell. I did some rereading of his blog, Race for the Iron Throne. .wordpress.com, and he's also on Tumblr, and he had a series of posts back in 2016 that were also published on Tower of the Hand, where he does a full history of each region, and his thoughts on this time period were helpful. Of course, like us, there's a lot of guessing and imagining and triangulating. I'm going to use that word a lot today. I'm just decided I'm going to do a lot of triangulation today. I use that word in all its forms to try and figure things out. And so his thoughts were really, really valuable. He's got a lot of expertise in this type of thinking. So, Sean, you had a note here. Comic-Con going on in Denver right now?
Yeah, I think they changed the name to the Denver Fan Expo. Oh. I don't know if that has to do with, I don't know if Comic-Con's in like an actual organization or it's some trademark, or maybe they just don't want to be pigeonholed to comic stuff because there's all kinds of Star Trek, Mandalorian, whatever else. But anyway, there was an artist named Mog Park from Game of Thrones that was there. And she had a lot of really good stories and insights to the production, and she was a big fan of the books and everything. And afterwards, Reed and I went talked to her and exchanged some information and stuff. But you should check out some of her art online. She was really passionate about the show, had a lot of cool, fun, interesting stories about the show and her life. And one little anecdote, they kept having her draw boats, which she likes to draw cats, you know what I mean? But they kept wanting her to draw boats, so she got really good at drawing boats. And a lot of the work was remote. And so her name, Mog, isn't very standard. And so she got to be known as the boat guy. She's not even a guy. You know? There's an example of the types of stories and insights that she had from the whole
remote boat
adventure of it. But
and I had happened to notice that name on the list of people that will be at San Diego Comic-Con, so I'll have a chance to chat with her in person.
Yeah, her presentation was very similar to David Peterson's at Ice and Fire Con.
Okay, yeah, very cool. That's awesome. I'm glad you got to do that.
I want to throw another quick thing in, if you don't mind. Someone in the chat last week asked about the movie. They said the movie poster behind me, but I don't know which one they meant. But this week, or the past couple of next weeks, I've got Moonlight on this side, drama, won Best Picture, story of a struggling young black man. This side is Contact, based on a Carl Sagan book starring Jodie Foster.
That's right. I remember seeing Contact in theaters.
Yeah.
Dating myself as usual.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm dating myself.
You couldn't find a date to see Contact?
That's right. I had to go alone. Yeah. I couldn't make contact. Yeah. So let's get to it. Welcome the questions if you have any, whether they're live or sent in advance. Quite a few people had some comments on this week's episode, so we'll get to those throughout. And a few are responses to previous episodes, which we're happy to delve into at the middle of the episodes, usually when we do that. Today will be about the same. Our trivia question to start off: you most surely recall, in some form or fashion, the anecdote of the Lord given charge of Dorne after the young dragon's conquest. This Lord pulled a sash to summon a bedmate and instead unleashed 100 red scorpions on himself. And that was the last thing he did, other than, scream and thrash and try to get away. So if you can name this person, half credit for naming their house, full credit for getting their whole name. I'll give you, it's not a clue, but some additional context. The character's house is named in A Song of Ice and Fire, but not their first name. Their first name is given in The World of Ice and Fire. That's the first time we got the full identity of this character. So it's an appropriate trivia question for this, since it's the World of Ice and Fire gave us the distinguisher there.
I can also tell you that it's depicted on Michael Klarfeld's Dorne map.
Oh, yeah, right on.
I see it right here, so I'm cheating.
So what we're doing is arbitrarily deciding to do 5 to 15 years before the conquest. I know that time frame is a bit vague, but so is our information, so it's appropriate. It's not, like I said at the beginning, it's not an explicitly covered timeline. We're working on this ourselves. We think it's an interesting timeline. We think it's a really interesting spot right before things changed for forever. Certainly things could change back in some way, but it was a permanent, semi-permanent shift in Westeros. And it's the state we find the Seven Kingdoms in now. It was an important shift, a big milestone. Our voters on Patreon also thought it would be interesting. That's why it was voted. We could have called it something else, like The Last Kings, or the Last Kingdoms, or something, the tail end of the Century of Blood. So the end of the Century of Blood, some sort of title to reference that. So let's do a little quick figuring out to get ourselves situated on where this timeline falls. You had a question, Sean?
But before we do that, I just also, I don't know, just thinking about the setup for this idea. Mm-hmm. I like the idea, like Martin does it in his world, and it's kind of part of the real world, but you see in a lot of literature, I'm thinking about it a lot from Better Call Saul too, that there are certain things that are sort of inevitable. Once you have certain things in motion, certain character types in play, things are gonna, for the most part, in a big picture way, go a certain direction. Like, it was kind of inevitable that eventually Europeans were going to come settle the Americas,
Okay, yeah.
And once that happened, probably they're going to be decimating the native population. It's slave trade, disease, some of the things, even if Christopher Columbus didn't do it, it was still going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Same thing. Probably Ned eventually was going to be hand of the king. Once Robert became king, at some point he's going to look to Ned to help him. Does that make sense? Like if Robert and Aaron hadn't been
John Aaron was old enough that
later anyway.
There's no way he's going to live to 100 or whatever. You know, I mean it's possible.
So, and right. You could go on, and maybe that doesn't happen, but you can see what I mean about certain things are kind. You know, like Joffrey was still going to be a little brat if that little confrontation with Micah and Arya didn't happen. Some other thing was going to happen. You know, things were going to go bad once Ned does go to King Landing. So same thing here in this world that Martin has set up. There's sort of this momentum of the state of things in the Seven Kingdoms, but every now and then you have these weird, unpredictable disruptions to what is naturally occurring,
like the Doom,
like a volcano going off, right?
Yeah,
someone maybe randomly dying or being injured in some way. Like I think I made that point one time about Bran Stark. Probably was eventually going to fall off those walls and hurt himself anyway. But maybe
but it wasn't like inevitable that he would catch Jaime and Cersei, right? That wasn't
right. That part wasn't. Yeah. So anyway,
although someone else might have caught them inevitably, that maybe you could say is inevitable.
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm off.
In fact,
I'm getting you off track here. Sorry.
Someone probably had already caught them and been executed for it.
Yeah,
right?
that's entirely possible. Yeah.
But eventually, someone will be caught that they can't handle, and it happened to be Bran.
Yeah, it's not like a servant person. Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, I just think that's a neat context to think about the state of Westeros before the Targaryens showed up. Is what course it seemed to be on.
Well, would you say? Let me ask you a question here on that line. Would you say that it was inevitable that the Dragon Lords would conquer Westeros, or at least expand from Dragonstone? Maybe not take the whole thing, but I mean, that's such a huge amount of power that enables you to conquer. Isn't it just inevitable that someone with the personality is going to be a Dragon Lord and be like, all right, here we go? I feel like that is kind of what happened. Aegon was that person, but maybe not. I don't know.
I could see that argument. I wouldn't argue too hard against it, but it's not my default thought because it seems like they would have already done it. The Targaryens have been in power for hundreds of years and haven't even spread out that much on their own continent, much less go to another continent. So maybe it's not crazy to think that some independent-minded person with a dragon or his family and their dragons might come to Westeros, but I don't know if that would have been inevitable, how long they would have lasted, especially if Westeros had a little longer to progress on the course it was on. Maybe even formed an alliance with them or had stronger forces to fight them. Other elements of magic that may have risen or fallen. I don't know.
Yeah. The magical thing is a big wild card. Yeah.
Even if it was inevitable, the fact that it happened at this moment and not another one is still interesting to think about how that interaction changes the course of things. Or it doesn't. Some things might still keep moving the way they were going to go. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons it maybe isn't the full picture and maybe isn't as big a factor as I want it to be or think it is the Century of Blood. Aegon's conquest somewhat coincided with the end of the Century of Blood, and it wasn't that like he saw the Century of Blood and he's like, okay, now I can conquer. He specifically had a major role in ending the Century of Blood. He and Argilac the Arrogant, two of our major characters today, actually fought against Volantis when their ambitions were imperial, and once Volantis was defeated, that pretty much wound down the Century of Blood. None of the great powers that emerged from the Century of Blood were trying to conquer each other anymore, at least not at that point. Of course, there more wars will come later, and it's sort of written that now that the East was settled, Aegon turned his attention west. And I wonder if that's not what the other Targaryens were doing as well. They were more like, okay, we got to see how things were working out over here. Maybe we got to get involved. Or maybe the opportunity wasn't there. One thing we'll get into, as you'll see here, when Aegon conquered Westeros, it was somewhat ripe for conquest. And maybe that's the opportunity that wasn't there. And maybe that's part of what was inevitable. Inevitably, there would be a state in which it was weak enough for someone to do this if they had the right. Maybe it wasn't inevitable, though, because Aegon had Balerion, which is the biggest dragon we've ever seen by a mile. And when we eventually cover the conquest, you'll see that Balerion was pretty instrumental in the whole thing. Without a particularly gigantic dragon, it may not have been possible. Maybe it still would have been. Maybe he would have conquered half of Westeros with a smaller dragon. Anyway, These are the kind of things we get to play with today. It's a lot of fun. Lots of imagining, lots of using logic and reason and trying to understand these characters and the way they've behaved in other scenarios to try to maybe guess at what they would do in these less certain times. And so there was less of a direct effect of the Doom on Westeros as there had been in Essos. It still hadn't been that long ago in historical memory. One of the characters we're going to talk about today, or as part of this great topic, the Yellow Toad of Dorne, Princess Meria. She was only about 20 years, or she was born when the Doom had only been 20 years or so before. And she's still in power at this point. So her mom could have told her mom and dad lived through the Doom. Could have told her about it. So it's just still how recent it was, you know. And you have a lot of these characters that are in charge at this time in Westeros. Argilac, pretty much an older guy. Loren Lannister, probably, maybe not, we're not sure about his age. But Mern Gardner, the last Gardner, his grandsons were squiring for him in his last battle. So he was up there in age. He may not have been old, but wasn't a young man. If you have grandsons, you're not young, you know. And so there's a lot of like older rulers, in some cases middle-aged, or in one or two cases younger, and that means that these rulers had seen a lot, and they had direct connections to people who were alive during the Doom and during all this great chaotic time period. So they've seen some stuff. Essos was still discovering its new identity in a world without the Dragon Lords, while Westeros was about to, ironically, become the only place ruled by Dragon Lords. But that hadn't happened yet. Things could still change quickly. People were seeing that. Like you said, Sean, the Doom's a great example of something that probably nobody predicted in the in-world. 20 years prior to the era we're zooming in on, so roughly 30 to 35 years before the conquest, the city of Gogossos, which emerged as a great power after the Doom, it was considered the 10th free city, saw all this. It got wealthy and powerful. It had sorcery and blood magic, and it was in a pretty strong position. It was erased rapidly when it was struck by the Red Death. And good example, something you can't really predict that happening. Sure, diseases are inevitable, but it isn't inevitable that the entire population is going to be wiped out by a disease. That's not inevitable. So
when and where it happens, you can't necessarily predict, but that it will happen somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's why I think a volcano or disease or something is a fair storytelling device for George to use, or any writer. Does that make sense? I think it is okay for random events to occur. And it's especially good for those to set up storylines, like Dany's eggs being bored, Brandon Stark falling, things like that initiate the storylines. But I don't think you want to resolve the storyline. If you set up all these characters and dilemmas and political intrigue, and then it ends because the volcano goes off and everyone dies. Well, that's not.
Yeah. That's maybe a little cheap. Like, I don't know what to do, so I'm just going to blow it all up. As a writer. You know?
I would also note, Sean, that the volcanoes blowing up isn't exactly the most random thing, you know, going by many theories. In this case, it wasn't like a random occurrence.
Right. I was trying to clarify, too, that even something like disease might be more predictable in one spot than another if it's a denser population. Or
port city where there's a lot of traffic. Yeah.
Where et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah. So. What a shame means in this case is there's this good chance the Doom was engineered. Still, it would look random to anyone who wasn't, on the outside.
But if you were watching, say, a show of the Doom of Valyria that culminated in, everyone dying, it would be the culmination of like the faceless men working towards something. You wouldn't just be like, oh, volcanoes went off, everyone died.
You wouldn't be surprised. You're like, oh my god, the Doom happened in a show about the Doom. Like, what the hell's going on here?
If Martin was writing that, he would probably put in all kinds of foreshadowing of like overmining that could interfere with plate tectonics or something like that.
Like all the things that like build it up nicely. Yeah, and I mean that in both ways, like the pressure and the story. So there were about 7 kingdoms at this time. The kingdom, the Dragonstone wasn't a kingdom. The Targaryens didn't call themselves kings. It was Blackwater Bay. It was a region. They may have been the biggest power in that small region, but they weren't kings yet.
I think you'd have to be a little pretentious to call that a kingdom also, right?
Well, it's like, what did Salladhor Saan call the Narrow Sea? He's like, I'm Admiral of the Narrow Sea. It's like, and so, 7 kingdoms, because the Riverlands were currently in possession of the Iron Islands. So they weren't independent at this point. And there weren't any crown lands yet. And there were probably a few other regions here and there that weren't fully claimed by one of the big seven. A couple of islands here and there, maybe some corners of kingdoms here and there that were claimed but not really ruled by their, like Duskendale is a good example. Duskendale and Stokeworth and Rosby, all these areas that are now part of the Crown Lands, were sort of controlled by Harren the Black. But they weren't like fully under his control. He claimed them, and they didn't want to make him angry because he was really powerful. But he was focused on building Harrenhal at this point, so they were it was in this sort of in-between state. There's no King's Road, of course. No King's Landing, even more importantly. Obviously, Aegon built that, so that's a huge power that's not there. A huge population center that just doesn't exist at this point, even though it's about to. And there's possibly more sellswords in Westeros at this point than perhaps ever, or at least in a long time, because, as we discussed during the Century of Blood, there was a big uptick in the formation of sellsword companies. All that chaos and war meant there were more people for hire, soldiers with no nation, with needing to make a living. And then, as we're told, in the World of Ice and Fire and elsewhere, once the war started to die down a bit, you had powerful sellsword captains that were engineering wars to drum up business for themselves. And that's obviously a bad thing for everyone, except those few people profiting from it. And that may have meant that some of these free companies were hired in Westeros. Houses with extra cash that were low on manpower now had an additional option. So I feel like this may have been an even more tumultuous time, thanks to the Century of Blood, that maybe we don't hear about it, but there's just more fighting men out in the world, and some Westerosi probably brought some of them over. Does that sound logical to you, Sean?
I can imagine all sorts of strife and turmoil that was going on that just got overshadowed when dragons take over, when a new ruler comes. A lot of things that might have been like adventurous or ambitions of someone's whole life just become meaningless relative to the new things that happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. So for the most part, what we're going to do is we're going to look at who was in charge during the conquest and assume that for the most part, especially if they're older, that's who was in charge 5 to 15 years before as well. There's going to be some exceptions to that, and we'll deal with those individually. But let's have our first quote of the day. This is from the World of Ice and Fire. It gives a nice overview of the state of things just before the conquest. This is pretty close to the time frame we're looking at, maybe 2 or 3 years past, but it's a general overview. It works quite well.
The Westeros of Aegon's youth was divided into 7 quarrelsome kingdoms, and there was hardly a time 2 or 3 of these kingdoms were not at war with one another. The vast, cold, stony north was ruled by the Starks of Winterfell. In the deserts of Dorne, the Martell princes held sway. The gold-rich Westerlands were ruled by the Lannisters of Casterly Rock, the Fertile Reach by the Gardeners of Highgarden. The Vale, Fingers, and the Mountains of the Moon belonged to House Arryn. But the most belligerent kings of Aegon's time were the two whose realms lay closest to Dragonstone, Harren the Black and Argilac the Arrogant.
So yeah, those two were both around for quite a while. Argilac the Arrogant is described as having gone white in his age. White is usually 60 or more, maybe 55 or more. And George usually describes like going gray as like late 30s, early 40s. It happens a little earlier for Westerosi because of stress and nutrition, But roughly speaking, you go gray in your late 40s and early 50s, and then you go white in your 60s and 70s. That's generally how George writes it. So Argilac is probably in the 60s or 70s by this point. Harren the Black, it took 40 years to build Harrenhal. And he was old and gray when he walks out on the battlements to talk to Aegon. So he's probably in his late 50s or something like that. Obviously, he probably didn't start building the castle when he was 15. And if it took almost 40 years, then that gives us a pretty solid time frame. I already mentioned Princess Mary, the Yellow Toad of Dorne, who's roughly 65 years old at this time and had been ruling Dorne for about 45 years. So she longest tenured ruler at this point. And she's no fool. You don't stay in power that long without learning a few things. We're not as sure about Lauren and Mern, like I said, and the Arryn situation is interesting. We'll get to that when we get to the Vale. Stephen Atwell, here's a note from Nina about about Stephen Atwell, who uses the term the Great Game to describe the pre-conquest scramble for territory and control among the various Westerosi great powers. Yeah, the Great Game, it is like the Game of Thrones. And the way the Great Game, it's a great description, because if you've ever played like a war board game, one thing that happens is there's like everyone sort of sits back and entrenches themselves, and you wait for someone to make a mistake. And if someone starts to get more powerful, that's when everybody gangs up on that person to keep them from getting the upper advantage, right? And then it returns to its state of parity where everyone's kind of got their own corner, and it's hard to reach out and expand because everyone's looking out for you to expand. And if you do that, that's the time to knock you back down. And that is what Westeros had done for some 4,000 to 5,000 years of this. And maybe that's, as an aside, this is why some people compellingly argue that Westeros history is not as long as it should be, or is too long. Like the maesters that say maybe history is only about 2,000 years and not 4,000 to 5,000 years. They have a point, maybe, because this is so long for this state to have endured. But that aside, whether it's endured for 4,000 or 5,000 years or 2,000 years or even only a few hundred years, this is the state of affairs. The Great Game, it's a very good description of that because of the board game metaphor and the Game of Thrones metaphor. No one could win. No one could ever get too much of an upper hand for very long. Although at this point, arguably, Harren the Black, the Hoare dynasty, had started to gain that sort of advantage. There's also an argument that they were absolutely inevitably, use that word again, going to screw it up because they ruled through extreme brutality, and that system can never hold forever. That's the system that's definitely going to fall apart at some point. When you're making everyone hate you, every king like 3 kings, 4 kings in a row makes all your subjects hate you. That's just not going to last. And indeed it didn't. As Aegon took advantage of that, one of many things he capitalized on was like, everybody hates this guy. Well, yeah, I could maybe get some support by going after him. Pretty smooth to go, instead of going for the weakest link, he went for the strongest link to both show his power and to win some acclaim for knocking off the big bully, right? It's like 2 things. Like, look how strong I am. I beat the big guy without getting any help first. And, like, everybody's like, thank you. We hated that guy. So, but that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. It's important context, but that's during the conquest. So let's back it up a little bit and talk about what was happening in Blackwater Bay around this time. Quote,
its location athwart the gullet gave its lords a stranglehold on Blackwater Bay and enabled both the Targaryens and their close allies, the Valarians of Driftmark, a lesser house of Valyrian descent, to fill their coffers off the passing trade. Valarian ships, along with those of another allied Valyrian house, the Celtigars of Claw Isle, dominated the middle reaches of the Narrow Sea, whilst the Targaryens ruled the skies with their dragons.
So it, meaning Dragonstone, if it wasn't clear, its position in the Narrow Sea or in the Blackwater Bay gave it that. The last known ruler of Dragonstone was Lord Aerion Targaryen, and before him was Lord Daemon Targaryen. Aerion was the son of Daemon, and Daemon was a third son. Daemon's brothers didn't have kids, so there's no possible living Uncle Targaryens at this point. But there could have maybe been an aunt or a cousin. Nina says, I do wonder it's a small-scale dynastic collapse of the Targaryens prior to the conquest. Aenar's senior great-grandson Maeggon doesn't seem to have married or have children, and Aegon the Conqueror's 2 senior great-uncles didn't either, like I said. So Daemon and Aerion both had a single son, perhaps, or at least only one that lived to adulthood, which did put them maybe on a little perilous footing as far as the dynasty just suddenly dying out because of an accident or something like that. Was this a consideration for them? Were they worried that their dynasty was imperiled? Was that giving them purpose or purposelessness given the danger they were in? And what are they doing? Like, their homeland was destroyed by the Doom. They've been sitting on Dragonstone for a while here. Like, this is a house that's kind of like, what's their purpose in the world at this point? Like, what are they? Their people are extinguished for the most part. Like, what would that do to you? You know, you're really rich. It's not like they're sad about their They're unable to have the luxuries they want. But I mean, that's kind of a narrow view to think that, they've got money, so they must be happy. No, of course not. But yeah, this was just a weird thing. Like, your entire culture was wiped out. It's been a while, but still, like, it's hard to frame that, don't you think, Sean? Like, it's difficult to imagine what that would be like.
Yeah, I have been thinking about it a lot, and I wish I knew more details of the scenario. Like, they're rich, but I don't know what obligations do they have.
Yeah,
like, how much does it take to feed the dragons? How many people live on Dragonstone? Are they taking care of those people? Like, I don't know how much are they generating new wealth? They're like, I'm making numbers up. Let's say they had 1 million gold.
Yeah.
And now they're down to 500,000 gold. And they're like, well, I don't know. In 20 more years, we're going to be out of money. Like, we're not generating new money. This adds to my thought that it might not have been inevitable for dragon riders to take over, because they're right there for 100 years and they didn't do it. I mean, eventually they did do it, but I can see, I don't know, it doesn't seem like they weren't clearly ambitious.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they weren't clearly ambitious, because there was not even an attempt that we know of. It wasn't like this was the second conquest. The first one failed. No, as far as we know, they were content to just collect, to dominate Blackwater Bay, make a lot of money that way, and that was enough.
It might even be part of why they finally did. They're like, we can't last like this forever. We have to do something,
Yeah.
And so maybe Aegon was just the first really ambitious guy that came along, or maybe they were so frustrated with what Harren was doing, they felt like they had to stand up for what's right and might as well have it. I'm not sure, but
it could be a lot of those factors too. Yeah, we don't have to just settle on one.
Another little thought I had was something else that might have made it more of an inevitable. Someone from Westeros might have eventually gone over and tried to attack Essos or the Valerians, right?
Yeah.
Which we saw their swift and complete retribution if that happens. Yeah. And so if Harren or some similar character had, I know.
So the mother of Aegon and Visenya and Rhaenys was Lady Valena Velaryon. Not only do we not know when Aerion died, their father, but we don't know what Lady Valena, what her deal was. She quite possibly was still alive during the conquest. Now, the father had to have died because Aegon became Lord. That much we know for sure. Aerion had to have died at some point, but a lot depends on when he died. For example, Aegon was 27 when the conquest began. Visenya was about 2 years older than him. The minute Aegon was born, it was determined that he would marry Visenya. That was obvious. Like, when Visenya was born, it wasn't sure who she would marry, but the second she had a younger brother within 2 years of her, it's pretty much settled. That's what Targaryens do, right? But if Aegon had come along 10 years later, they probably wouldn't have married. He might have automatically married Rhaenys instead of chosen to marry Rhaenys later, but that would have also depended on when she was born. So that part was basically decided the second he was born. But what we didn't know, what's not necessarily clear as an important data point here, is that they were dragon lords. All three, it says that all three, Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys, were dragon riders before they were married. We also can be pretty sure Aegon didn't marry Rhaenys until after he became Lord. He took an extra wife once he had the power to do that. I don't think his father would have allowed that. It was unusual. It sounds like something he did after he took full control. He also didn't have the painted table made until he was Lord. It says Lord Aegon had ordered the construction of the painted table. So there's this narrow range potentially when maybe Aerion was alive at this reign during 15 years out. Maybe he was dead by 5 years out. Somewhere in between, he passed. It's kind of my guess there. That's kind of roughly what I'm thinking. Was his dragon alive? That's the question. If his dragon was alive, it would have passed, because if they're all dragon riders before they were married, that implies that's pretty relatively young, because we know Visenya and Aegon probably got married relatively youngish, because it was a foregone conclusion the minute he was born. No reason to wait, right? They weren't rushing, but it's different from everybody else, right? We talk about this in other scenarios where these teenage marriages amongst the nobility are not as common when things aren't tumultuous. Usually we can wait longer. But when you're shoring up alliances and to have marriage alliances so soldiers can fight on the same side, that has to happen quickly. You can't wait on that. You have to have the marriage now. You can't wait on that. Otherwise people can back out. So most people, even arranged marriages, you can wait on. There's no urgency to it. But in this case, most people don't know who they're marrying the minute they're born. It's like, in this case, it's a why wait situation rather than a why rush it situation. Either way, the point is, if they all had dragons before they were married, that means Aerion had a different dragon, because he can't have had Balerion if Aegon was already riding Balerion. He couldn't have had Vhagar if Visenya was already riding Vhagar. Ditto Meraxes, right? So my guess is he had either it was a Viserys situation, Viserys the First, who we're going to see a lot of on House of the Dragon, when he was the last rider of Balerion. And when Balerion died, he was just like, I don't need another dragon. He just went dragonless for the next 37 years of his life, or 39 years of his life. He's like, I'm king. I don't need a dragon. Screw it. So kind of maybe that's what happened with Aerion. Aerion's dragon passed, because we know 4 or so dragons that came over after the Doom died in this era, and they didn't die from battle as far as we know, at least not fighting other dragons. And so any reaction to this stuff, Sean? I've been going off for a minute here.
No, I was thinking about it. I think there is room for weird exceptions to what you're saying, but you're definitely naming the most likely occurrence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. What are some possibilities that stand out to you that you think are interesting, or
like maybe someone had a dragon, then the dragon died quickly for some random reason. So,
it could have been an older dragon. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, maybe Aegon had a dragon that died and then got another dragon, or then got Balerion, or what I mean? Something possible. Like that.
Yeah. Because if his dragon died when he was young, he would want another one. But if you're old and your dragon dies, you might be like, I don't need to go. I don't need a dragon. I'm already old. But
I think what you're saying is all really good for making predictions.
Yeah.
But if it turns out to be some different thing, there are ways we can make sense
none of these predictions should be seen as super likely. Maybe they're just arguably the most likely, but even that is not certain. It's just a good way to frame it, and to kind of, it's a starting point.
I would even say they're super likely. I would give them, well over 50%.
At least a lot of these things. Maybe not if we hone in on specifics, but sure.
Yeah.
So we also know that they traveled around a bit. Like Visenya and Aegon may have gone to Lannisport. They definitely went to the Citadel, and we hear that Aegon went hawking on the Arbor. It's a good place to go. Smart move by the Arbor to befriend Aegon, the future conqueror. And it seems like they had positive relations going forward, the Arbor and the conqueror. Nina also writes, given that Gaemon the Glorious, that's one of the ancestors, I think that was the grandfather of Daemon, who was Aerion's father. So he had multiple daughters, one of whom married a petty lord who attempted to claim the throne at the Great Council of 101, which we'll see in House of the Dragon. We may even see this moment. I wonder whether there will be any other Targaryen daughters or their other non-Targaryen descendants hanging around Dragonstone in this era. So that's a great idea from Nina here, that because we have this example of Gaemon the Glorious having extra daughters, there could be other Targaryen-blooded cousins or people who are a little more distant, but still definitely of the family. So yeah, the line from Fire and Blood is, all 3 siblings had showed themselves to be dragonlords before they wed. Balerion is already 100 years old at this point. Just an important thing to note. Balerion was young when they came to Dragonstone, but of course this Dragonstone period is almost 100 years long before the conquest. Vhagar was born in the year 52. So around this era, about 40. So full grown, but not as monstrous as she would become. Meraxes was probably the youngest. That's not entirely clear. Definitely younger than Balerion. But Meraxes ended up just huge for some reason. Maybe even bigger than Vhagar got. Maybe even not bigger than Balerion, I don't think. But Tyrion sees the skull of Meraxes really early in Game of Thrones and is like, that's even bigger. And it's like, really? Meraxes is bigger? It's okay. Maybe he got his skulls mixed up. But anyway, that's not an important question for us to solve right now.
Maybe he just had a big head.
Yeah, that's right. It was just an unusually large head for a dragon. Had a small body, roll like a giraffe.
Tyrannosaurus Rex dragon.
So there's a house called, at this point they weren't a house, but they will soon become a house. It's House Coharis. They were the first lords of Harrenhal. And that, of course, is a slightly semantic trick there. The first Lord of Harrenhal, the first king of Harrenhal was Harren the Black. But after he was defeated, the first person given the castle was this guy, Sir Quentyn Coharies, who was the master at arms on Dragonstone. That's not a position for a young man, generally. So we can be pretty sure this guy was the one who taught both Aegon and Visenya. She knew how to fight, probably Rhaenys as well. I mean, she may not have been a big swordswoman, but she definitely went into battle. So she probably had at least some training with a sword. And Visenya wielded Dark Sister, so that, there's no question. She wielded the sword plenty of times. And Orys Baratheon, supposedly Aegon's half-brother, which would also mean he's Visenya and Rhaenys' half-brother, would have also been trained at arms by this Sir Quentyn Coharies guy. And he must have done a good job and been well regarded to be given Harrenhal, right? That seems a pretty big reward.
He wasn't Targaryen, though, right?
He was Valyrian, but not Targaryen, yeah.
He was Valyrian,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah,
okay.
So he was probably silver-haired.
Are there any remnants of that house?
No. They screwed it up pretty bad. And Quentin's grandson was a terrible, terrible guy who got himself killed by doing terrible, terrible things. We'll discuss him later, but he was awful. And made sure that he had no descendants through his awfulness. So Orys Baratheon, important character, the founder or subsumer of House Durrandon that turned it into House Baratheon, but kept most of its symbolism in place, kept the same sigil and married the last princess of Durrandon, so he even kind of looked like them. So it really was a smooth transition in a lot of ways from the outside. So there's a quote here: even before the conquest, he served as Aegon's champion and sworn shield, and was considered his childhood friend, which implies they were close age. Does that? I guess we lost him. Does that imply to you, Ashaya? What do you think? Does that just childhood friend imply near the same age? Is that how you read that?
Yes, that does. I mean, and if it's true that they're related, a little more than childhood friends, it also implies that. Yeah,
that's true. There's a chance they weren't related, but it's such a vague notion that it's never proven that he was actually his half-brother, but I think he was. So, but what I don't know is whether Orys was older or younger than Aegon. It's probably not important, but I kind of think my guess is he was slightly older.
I guess I would have said I thought slightly younger, but I don't know.
If it wasn't for Visenya existing, I might have guessed younger. But
okay, but as a half-brother, it makes some sense.
But there's also no reason why a lord can't have a bastard with his lover before his wife, especially if his arranged marriage wife was a lot younger than him and he was, had a lover before that. But anyway, pure guesswork. But they had to be. But if we're keeping them close in age, there's fewer options as far as that goes. Excuse me. He would later reward, quote, his oldest supporters with the high offices on his small council, like Master Ships and Commander Kingsguard and all that. So we can kind of assume that some of these next group of figures were around in this era and prominent, because for them to have been oldest supporters, well, they were probably around 5 years before, if not 10 or 15 years before. Lord Daemon Velaryon was the first Master of Ships. His grandson was named Daemon and was also Master of Ships to King Maegor and then King Jaehaerys. So there's a history of Daemon Velaryons being Master of Ships. His granddaughter Alyssa married Aenys the First. So he was great-grandfather to Jaehaerys and Alysanne, and that in turn makes him great-great-great-grandfather to Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, which in turn makes him great-great-great-great-great-grandfather to Daemon Blackfyre. So, we got to keep all our Daemon connections straight here. There's also a Sir Corlys Velaryon, not to be confused with the Sea Snake. The first Lord Commander of the Kingsguard is this guy, Sir Corlys Velaryon. The Kingsguard was formed in the year 10 AC, so 10 years after the conquest. Now, this guy had to be alive 5 to 15 years before the conquest if he's the first Lord Commander of the Kingsguard in 10 AC. And I don't think 5 years before the conquest he would have only been 15 otherwise if he was born then. So 15 years before the conquest, we're still talking about only 25-year-old man. So I'm guessing he was even older than that. to be a Lord Commander, to be the first Lord Commander. He wasn't the firstborn of Daemon. So this is Daemon's second or third son. We're not sure which. It could even be fourth son, but the firstborn was Aethan Velaryon, and Corlys was farther down the line. There was also a Lord Crispian Celtigar. Crispian, he was the first Master of Coin, and he died between 1 and 9 AC. So it sounds like, could have been an accident, but again, oldest supporter. So he was probably Lord of Claw Isle for a good length of time. Aegon probably worked with him, stuff like that. The first Master of Laws was Tristan Massey. He was sworn to House Durrandon pre-conquest, but had closer ties to Dragonstone. So that's interesting. Like, basically, Aegon was sort of just pulled him over. I guess his ancestors did as well. You have your vassal or your overlord is Storm's End, but you'd rather be a vassal of Dragonstone. You're like, I like these guys better. And Nina writes, this is a sign of the declining power of the Storm Kings, that this vassal of theirs was just hanging out more with the Targaryens, and he couldn't really do much about it. So that's kind of noteworthy there. We also have Lord Bar Emmon of Sharp Point, who was also on Aegon's team, and that's part of the Massey's Hook region there. Here is another quote about another famous part of what's now the Crownlands.
At that time, Duskendale was the principal Westerosi port on the Narrow Sea, and had grown fat and wealthy from the trade that passed through its harbor.
It's a good example of a semi-independent but not kingly spot. They had been kings back in the Age of Heroes, but had been overwhelmed by the Andals while not being erased, like so many other houses were just sort of taken over rather than completely wiped out. We also have Lord Mooten of Maidenpool nearby, possibly the older brother of the Lord John, who will eventually submit to Aegon, because Lord John is going to submit to Aegon after his brother is killed in battle by Aegon. So this is probably that guy that gets killed. But here's what we had in place of King's Landing. This is an interesting quote to describe what was going on in that general region in place of what's now a bustling, heavy populated city.
In the days of the 100 Kingdoms, many petty kings had claimed dominion over the river mouth, amongst them the Darkland kings of Duskendale, the Masseys of Stonedance, and the river kings of old, be they Mudds, Fishers, Brackens, Blackwoods, or Hooks. Towers and forts had crowned the three hills at various times, only to be thrown down in one war or another. Now, only broken stones and overgrown ruins remained to welcome the Targaryens. Though claimed by both Storm's End and Harrenhal, the river mouth was undefended, and the closest castles were held by lesser lords of no great power or military prowess, and lords, moreover, who had little reason to love their nominal overlord, Harren the Black.
There we go. There's that name again, Harren the Black. Yeah. Little reason to love. In fact, that's putting it mildly. They had a lot of reasons to hate. And we have little reason to believe a few years before that statement that it was much different. We're only talking a few years back from what this is saying. So all of the lords of the Crownlands were concerned about Harren the Black, as well as the king of the Stormlands. But let's start with Harren the Black himself. Kingdom of Isles and Rivers. Not only was there Harren the Black, a.k.a. King Harren Hoare, he had at least 4 sons, 2 at least of whom were old enough for battle because they would fight in the conquest. Probably all 4 of them were old enough for battle, though, given how old Harren was. There's also a Lord Edmund Tully who is important in this time frame, or perhaps his father, because it would be Edmund Tully who becomes the new Lord of... the new High Lord, Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, after joining Aegon, being one of the first to turn on Harren the Black. So since Harren spent almost 40 years building Harrenhal, the legends famously say it was finished the same day Aegon set foot on Westeros with conquest in mind. So what we're looking at is 25 to 30 years, or 35 years into that project. we'll say 20 to 35, something like that, whatever. Huge amounts of progress have been made, and massive suffering along with it. He basically was enslaving people to do this and raiding other kingdoms. It was terrible. And hated by all those he ruled. Again, I'll keep repeating that because it needs to be emphasized. But still, a lot of time was left before this castle would be finished. Even though a lot had been done and he had sown a lot of hatred, it was still his main focus for now. So, but it was like a waiting period. Everybody knew that when he finished, he was going to probably start trying to exercise his power again and start getting back to conquering rather than building this castle that would enable him to extend his domains. So that's what a lot of other rulers were sort of waiting for him. And like, well, when's the other shoe going to drop and what are we going to do in the meantime? Obviously, they probably didn't predict Aegon the Conqueror coming along, so they answered the question. That answered the question for them, but it must have made them all very anxious. Nina says, it's important to emphasize just how long the Riverlands had been without a strong popular native dynasty of its own. By the time of the conquest, the Riverlands had been around for been ruled for around a century by House Hoare, that is, by a foreign power which considered all non-Ironborn people slaves, destined to work for the benefit of the Drowned God's chosen race. Yeah, the Ironborn considered themselves superior to the people they conquered. So, but for 3 centuries before that, the Riverlands were ruled by the Stormlands, by House Durrandon, so they weren't independent then either. So this is like 400 years of not independence, right? And going really far back to when there was a king of the rivers, a king of the Trident, even that person was a foreigner, a non-native Riverlander that established a dynasty over them. So it'd been a long time before the Riverlands was self-governed, and it may be something that they didn't really think was possible anymore because it had been so long, but this has been the state of affairs for a really long time. The River Lords themselves were often prone to infighting, which is part of what made them more conquerable by outside powers. And it's amazing that finally someone came along that they all hated so much that they were able to unite against him, and that's Harren the Black. You really, really have to make yourself hated to get the River Lords to unite against you, especially in this era. So, I mean, they teamed up, they allied with House Hoare to drive out the Storm Kings 100 years ago, and they exchanged a brutal master for a more brutal master who had a better ability to control them because he was closer. Because the Stormlands are farther away and has a much wider border. And you can attack the Stormlands over land, whereas the Riverlands can't really strike back against the Iron Islands very easily because of the fact that the Iron Islands dominate the sea between them. Quite a conundrum for them, huh? So it's no wonder, as Nina writes, that the Riverlands were very happy to join Aegon because this was somebody that they could see was going to probably give them a chance, at least, if not an independence, more independent than they had, like something semi-independent. So, yeah. Now, as we were saying about the area of King's Landing, or that would become King's Landing, that was certainly a target for Harren the Black to firm up. As soon as the castle's done, that's one of the most obvious areas that he's going to extend greater control over. And there's not a lot to say about the Iron Islands themselves at this point in history, but it's worth a few mentions because they were mostly backburnered, right? Harren and his father Halleck and his father Harwin Hardhand had mostly used the Iron Isles as a source of manpower. They would recruit the fearsome Ironborn warriors and use them to dominate this new kingdom. But the Hoares were different. They were more about the new way than the old way. They weren't big on reaving so much as they were on trade. You might think, oh, they were more progressive and modern. In a sense, it's a step towards a rehabilitated Ironborn, but it's not as good as it may sound. Because yes, they were more about trade and making connections rather than reaving and full-blown taking, but the reason they were interested in trade is so that they could build up greater military and use it for conquest. So they had bigger goals with their military than just reaving and stuff like that. So it's still a war economy. It's still a militaristic scenario. It's just a different version of that. It's less religious and glory focused and more about just standard ruthless pursuit of wealth and power. It's more familiar, right? And so Harren and perhaps his unnamed heir, and even more so, they were planning. This was relatively close to the end. They could probably see the light at the end of the tunnel. Once we finish Harrenhal, I don't even know if they had the name for that yet. They probably did. What can we do? We can go around and expand our domains even more. They're probably excited for that. They were probably looking forward to all the rampaging they could do, all the new conquests. And think about, in this scenario, just how awful, like the heir to Harren's seat, he must have been a real piece of work. They treated their subjects like I said, like second-class citizens. They could do whatever they want to them. There weren't like prohibitions. So just imagine the worst rich kid you can, the most brutal rich kid you can that can just get away with whatever he wants. That's probably Harren's heir, if not all his sons. Just riding around the Riverlands doing whatever they want, taking whoever they want, abusing whoever they wanted, doing whatever. Yeah, like that's not good. And the reason I point this out is just to paint a picture of how hated they must have been. They never tried to win over their subjects. Not even in prior eras. This was just why I mentioned earlier that it was inevitable that it would fail, because if you can't win over your subjects, there's gonna be a time that you're weak and they will take advantage of and overthrow you. You can't be strong forever. There's got to be dips in your ability to hold them off. And the more they hate you, the more they're gonna be willing to take risks to overthrow you. And this is a very, very hated man, a very hated dynasty. So they were from their perspective, they thought they were in an enormously powerful position and on their way to an even more powerful position. I mean, think about this. Control of the God's Eye allows you to send ships to the East Coast without having to sail around Dorne. They could also do that with control of the Trident. But that puts you north of Maidenpool and Crackclaw Point, which you also have to sail around. By controlling the God's Eye, they can go straight from the lake right out into Blackwater Bay, which is, I'm sure they were planning on doing that. Yeah, the Targaryens were dominating that region with Dragonstone, but imagine if Harren the Black started doing that. And that's probably something Aegon saw, and probably something Harren saw too. They both probably realized they would be coming into conflict with each other eventually, as they both were looking to the same region for growth. Now, so this new way, of course, is going to end. Once the Hoare dynasty is wiped out by Aegon, he's going to reappoint the Greyjoys, and the Greyjoys are going to return to the old way, about 100 years later. Those jerks. Real setback there. So despite all this growth and this gigantic castle, what they were really sowing, and they're allowed to sow, because this is House Hoare, not House Greyjoy, was hatred. You can rule by fear, you can rule by love, you can rule with a combination of the two, with strength, cunning, administrative talents. But hate, that just doesn't work. Nothing binds people who would never otherwise work together than hate. And only hate stops them from working together when all other options are exhausted, right? These guys, the House Hoare dynasty, played power politics like mainlanders, but still ruled their subjects like Ironborn. And there's little as powerful as hatred in this world. So when Aegon's going to come along and knock them off later, like I said, it's going to make him look really good, because you're taking out someone that everyone hated, that was just treating people unethically, unjustly, dishonorably. This would also be something that is notable, that Aegon would curb the practice of salt wife taking. He didn't eliminate it, but he curbed it, which probably means there was a lot of salt wives in this era. We have to assume that if it was curbed, that there were more of it going on in this time. So that's a good thing that he reduced that. But it's a good example of the kind of anything goes situation that was happening in this kingdom. No wonder people wanted to get rid of it. One of the ways a smaller tyrannical government can hold power over a much larger populace is to encourage infighting. The Riverlands has always been a disunited place, as I've been saying, and as we've said elsewhere. It's probably the region that's had the most different kings and dynasties over its full history. So internal quarreling is like a feature or pastime of sorts. And House Horror took great advantage of this by encouraging that. Now, the Ironborn have always kind of in general lived this way with a lot of infighting. Strong beats strong, rawr, might makes right, grr. You know the song. But that's been curbed by religion, because the Iron Priests say Ironborn shouldn't make war on each other. Now, of course, they still do, but it's reduced the amount. It's kept a lot of that violence pointed outwards towards other nations. So they're good at that. They're good at this game of back and forth. They're good at encouraging warfare. So what happens when you encourage infighting, blood feuds, and the like in a place with the most famous long-running feud of all time in Westeros? You may have guessed where this is headed when I mentioned the longest-running feud in Westeros and encouraging feuds. And we've got a passage from the World of Ice and Fire to quote.
A decade before Aegon's conquest, the Blackwoods and Brackens had entered into a new private war in their ancient feud. Previously, their Ironborn overlords had largely ignored such conflicts amongst their vassals. Indeed, if the Iron Chronicle can be believed, Harwin Hardhand oft seen to pit his bannermen against one another to keep them weak.
Yeah, and I said that this is typical because there's lots of examples in real-world history where a king will play the powerful nobles against each other in order to keep them from getting too powerful, so they can't challenge him. It's part of the plot of Dune, in fact. So the Emperor, Padishah Emperor, gets the Harkonnens and Atreides to fight each other, partly because they kind of already wanted to, or at least one of them did. So, sometimes the groundwork is already laid for these feuds to begin because they only need a little bit of encouragement to start back up again. So clearly, Harren the Black was learned from his father and kept that going. So this is right in our wheelhouse for time frame because, as that quote said, a decade before Aegon's conquest. Right in there. Now, in this case, the quote, if we were to go farther in this passage, what it would say is that in this case, they went so far that Bracken and Blackwood actually, their war interfered with the construction of Harrenhal. So Harren actually had to stop them. Otherwise, he would have just let them tear each other apart. But he's like, hey, you're messing with my castle here. We can't have that. So he went and attacked them both and weakened them both severely, which again sets up Aegon. By the time Aegon comes around, the most powerful vassal of the Horror Dynasty is the Tullys, who immediately turned on them. Even if Bracken and Blackwood stayed loyal to Harren the Black, they were severely weakened by fighting each other and then getting put down entirely by him. So what help would they have even been? And that's why they were not well prepared when the conquest came along. They were both in a period of weakness given this had just happened. So, yeah. So, put all that together. The Brackens and Blackwoods did turn. They didn't stay loyal. They did join the Tullys and all these others. But had they been at fuller strength, it might have been one of them that emerged on top and been granted the High Lordship from Aegon instead of the Tullys. But a bigger point, again, is to reemphasize the power of hatred here. The Blackwoods and Brackens hate each other. You really have to be hated to be like, Bracken, Blackwood, we're going to work together because we hate this guy even more. That's really saying something. The Brackens and Blackwoods were like, you know what? We hate Harren the Black even more than we hate each other. So let's do that. Let's join together. Right? One of the other few times we see this is in Robb Stark brings them together, and Catelyn's like, wow, even the Brackens and Blackwoods are agreeing. That's really something. It's a way to emphasize how unique and powerful Robb's coalition is. In this case, it's sort of the opposite. They like Robb and hate the Lannisters so much. In this case, there's not so much like, it's just pure hate. Okay, there's a little subtopic that somewhat relates to Harren. It relates to other kingdoms as well, but maybe the trigger point for this topic is the fact that Harren the Black not only was pissing off a lot of other kings and just regular folk with his savagery and brutality and working people to death and stealing all their stuff to build his castle, he cut down a lot of werewoods. So he may have pissed off some supernatural beings as well, because obviously that's a big no-no, right? I mean, wars started over that in the past. So we don't know what behind the scenes the children of the forest were thinking about this, whether they wanted to send some curse on him or whether it triggered something in the far north. Maybe this got the others active. Maybe something like this was what got it all started again. Who knows? We have no idea what made the others come back, whether it was just time or whether there was some trigger, and could be something along these lines. We are told, and even George doesn't endorse this theory necessarily, but he mentioned it. And the fact that he even mentioned it is pretty interesting. And the idea is that maybe Aegon the Conqueror needed Westeros to be one realm in order to unite against the others. Now, that's an amazing amount of forethought. But again, the fact that George even referenced this, he said, some people have talked about this. It's like the way of, it's like, yeah, some people are saying. It doesn't mean it's true. It's just people are talking about it. So he didn't fully endorse it, but George doesn't usually bring up theories at all. Other people's theories at all. Unless it's like an in-world theory that his own characters have. He might refer to that. But referring to fan theories is unusual, which makes me think maybe it's not entirely a fan theory. Maybe when George brought that up, he was actually alluding to something that maybe some of the Targaryens discussed or something like that.
Yeah, I think that as well.
Maybe there's like prophecies. I mean, if there's going to be some prophecies, that the Targaryens are going to be not an unlikely source for that, right? I mean, obviously, prophecies come from other places, but Aegon, maybe one of these other cousins or someone had a vision, dragon dreams. Maybe he did.
Yeah. Maybe there's just a book of Daenerys the Dreamer's dreams, and Aegon has read it many times,
Great
and
point.
one of them stood out to him.
Signs and portents. Yeah, she wrote down a whole lot of her dreams.
Yeah, so it could just come straight from that, but it could be from another Targaryen as well, for sure.
And if Daenerys the Dreamer's dreams, whatever she dreamed, you got to take seriously, because she predicted the doom, and that came true. You're like, well, she's, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Like, okay, yeah, no, it's hard to reject the predictions of someone who called that one. Maybe she was wrong about everything else. It was like, what you don't know is that 100 predictions, and that was the only one that was right. No, probably not. I'm guessing that she had a lot of correct predictions. Nina writes here, a little bit of interest as well. You might wonder how the study of the higher mysteries was going at this time, when there were multiple large living dragons around and the last of Valyria's sorcerer prince families living comparatively close by. Did the Citadel, or at least those maesters booking to earn a Valyrian steel link, or overseeing the teaching of the higher mysteries, think about interviewing the Targaryens, or going to Dragonstone to study them or their dragons? Did the glass candles burn at this time? And if so, were they affected post-Doom? Did the Doom shut them off, or did the Doom turn them on? Or I doubt they turned them off, but... turned them on, rather. I doubt it turned them on, but it could have turned them off, but it may have just made them work less good, or who knows? We know the glass candles are burning now, but we don't know when they turned off, right? On the opposite side, how much interest did the remaining Targaryens have in keeping up with magic or sorcery? Were they emphasizing this? Were they trying to stoke the flames of sorcery, try to keep it alive? What knowledge they still have, were they encouraging it amongst their extended family?
Dancing's joined.
Were they encouraging that amongst their extended family or anything like that? I don't know, but it seems not unlikely. I mean, it's a source of power. Why would they want to give that up? Why would they want to be like, sorcery, it's not worth it, If it's something that gives them power, I would think they would want to make use of that. People don't give up on power easily, do they? So unless they lost it or couldn't use it, which is entirely possible, you got to think some stuff was going on there. Welcome back, Sean. Sean was gone for a little while there. You may have been wondering, if you're just listening, you didn't see that he was gone.
He's gone for about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
I've returned from the Shadow Realm.
So, catching you back up, we're discussing ideas for magic in this time. Were the glass candles on? were
I didn't want to discuss magic anyway.
Yeah,
so.
magic's boring. Yeah. So Harren the Black cut down a bunch of werewoods, which possibly upset some supernatural balance or supernatural beings. And he's right on the God's Eye, which is this, mysterious lake right where the Isle of Faces is. So he's not too far from Dragonstone. The Valyrian sorcerers are closer to the Isle of Faces than they've ever been in terms of pure proximity. So it's an interesting bit of circumstances that we can't get answers from, but it's very compelling to consider. I'm not sure if you had thought about this ahead of time or if you have any thoughts on it now, but fire away.
Let me ask a question or two.
Yeah.
The God's Eye is the big lake almost right in the middle of Westeros.
Yeah.
Right, and it has an island on it, which is
where the green
preserved for werewoods. Ostensibly, there's some cult or entity, the Green Men, they're looking over them.
Correct.
How isolated is this lake? Does it have rivers running into and out of it?
It has one particularly large river that becomes the Blackwater Rush. So it goes to it flows out eventually into Blackwater Bay. But it doesn't have a lot of other river access from the maps.
And it flows out, so it's hard to sail upstream. I'm just wondering, I don't know, what kind of access, how important.
The lake itself is important. You missed that as well, where the fact that they already had control over the Trident, so they have strong control over the west coast because it gives them access to the sea, and they already have the Iron Isles themselves. This gave them a path to deploy ships from this giant central castle out onto the lake, down the rivers, and out into Blackwater Bay. So it gives them a whole nother theater of control that they didn't have before, with this really huge, powerful base to operate out of.
So we don't have a lot of stories or insight about the island in the middle of the God's Eye.
Not as much.
Harren or someone under him might have done something there too.
He might have tried. Yeah,
if we're thinking about how he might have disrupted the status quo through, mystical means, that might be something that happened,
It's interesting because if he was trying to cut down werewoods because he was using them for beams and things like that, he wanted fancy white wood in his castle, I guess, then he may have been like, hey, there's werewoods over there, let's see if we can get those. But it doesn't seem like he succeeded. For whatever reason, all the same factors that keep other people from being able to reach the Isle of Faces would have been true for him as well. Also, it's kind of
leave it to Euron. He'll do it.
It's also kind of awkward, like shipping, like sending ships and then cutting down trees, and then that's usually you float trees down river. Like hauling huge amounts of timber like that is difficult. So as far as I understand it, so it may not have been the best idea anyway. It may not have been something he wanted to do, but it's definitely possible that this was some balance that he upset or kicked off or played a role in. So yeah, we really wonder what the Valyrians were doing at this time. Was it waning? Was magic waning for them? Were they could have been some deep phase of magical recession could have been what caused them to lose some of these secrets for good. It might be like some phase of particularly low magic that caused them to fall out of practice or just lose their ability to tap in. They lost, the people who had that practice lost it because they couldn't keep doing it or couldn't pass the information down to their ancestor or their descendants. Bunch of guesses here, but this stuff is definitely going on some form or fashion. And connecting it to the presence of dragons is smart because of that is presented as a strong possibility within A Song of Ice and Fire.
Let me ask another question about the state of things, because that's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Harren was Lord of the Iron Islands, and he expanded into
he was
the
king.
mainland of Westeros.
King. Yeah.
King of the right.
Well, no, he didn't expand in the Riverlands. His grandfather did. He took over. His grandfather, Harwin Hardhand, conquered the Riverlands from the Stormlands. The Storm Kings had the Riverlands. He took it from them. And he got them to rise up against the Storm Kings and fight for him, and then he treated them even worse. And then his son Halleck took over, and Halleck was just a similar kind of man, but not as smart, and kind of screwed things up, but not enough to lose the kingdom. And then Harren the Black comes along, and Harren's like, okay, here's how we're going to make this work. We built this giant castle because we're low on manpower. We're trying to govern way more people than we have soldiers for, but a giant castle is going to help us do that. And if he had finished it, it would have been really interesting to see how that exercise of power would have worked out in the long term. Whether hatred would have boiled back up against him and he would have been overthrown, or whether the very dominant position they had, how long he would have been able to hold that, whether his descendants would have been able to make some moves to hold on to that. It's really, really compelling what if scenario.
You're stirring even more questions in me than what I already had. Like, okay, where did Harren and his father and grandfather, where did they rule from? Did they sit at the Iron Islands and send edicts out across Westeros, or were they sitting in the Riverlands?
Good.
Sending edicts out to the Iron Islands?
Great question. I can answer it. King Harwin was mostly a saddle king because he was conquering the Riverlands. So a lot of his reign was just moving around from place to place, conquering and reestablishing and putting down revolts. Halleck was the second one. Halleck ruled from Fairmarket, which is near Harrenhal. It's a small town, but it's not very defensible and not a very kingly seat. So, and there is no kingly seat in the Riverlands. That's the problem. There's no like one seat you can overthrow and be like, okay, I'm going to take this over. This is mine now, and I can dominate the region with it. That's kind of a feature of the Riverlands is no one ever built a giant castle there, like a really dominant position there until this. So that's what they were doing. They're like, we'll build this huge castle, and people will have to look on us as equals. No matter how big a king you are, our castle's now as big as it's bigger than Winterfell. It's bigger than Castle Rock. Maybe not as rich, maybe not as powerful, but in that league. Way bigger than the Eyrie. Way bigger than Highgarden. Again, maybe not as rich, but give it time. So they just like push their way onto the front of the stage. Like, you cannot ignore the power of this castle. It's like, people declare themselves king, and you'd be like, he's just calling himself king. He's not very powerful. But when you have this monstrous castle in the center of the continent and two kingdoms behind you, you're like, yeah, this guy is powerful. And they're making a statement. It's symbolic power and it's real power.
Okay, so let me try to keep my thought process. I'm going to ask one question. Who is in charge back in the Iron Islands? Kind of like when Tywin is, in Castle Rock and he's the hand, but someone still has to be in charge of Tywin's in King's Landing, but someone still has to be in charge of Castle Rock. When Ned goes to King's Landing, the Stark is always
he left Bran and Sir Roderick behind, Robb, and then Robb went off to
So who's in charge in Iron Islands?
Well, it would probably be someone in his family. He probably left like a cousin or uncle in charge, but it's not specified. It's not, we don't know.
We barely know who it is, much less how competent or successful they are.
We have some idea based on who tried to take over. We could guess based on who tried to take over after Harren was overthrown and all his sons were killed. There was a few people that tried to take power after that, but that's a whole other conversation. And it's pretty much guesswork too. So we don't really know.
But it ended up being the Greyjoys?
The Greyjoys were appointed by Aegon. Aegon was like, this is who he's going to rule you now. He looked into their dynastic history and was like, okay, this one. Because he had a plan. Aegon had a plan that he stuck to for who he appointed and put in charge. He always appointed someone that was medium power.
Yeah.
Someone that they wouldn't rally behind. Someone that the region wouldn't rally behind to come after him. Like the Tyrells were not like people. Appointing the Tyrells created infighting because other people were like, we're better than the Tyrells. We should have had Highgarden. So they become the focal point of rebellion instead of the Targaryens. Is like they want to take Highgarden. They don't want to overthrow the Targaryens. And it's the same thing happened in Riverrun. Edmund Tully was given it. So the Tullys.
He needs someone who's strong enough they can't be easily overthrown.
Right.
Respectable enough that people will have to go along with it, but not strong enough that they're going to rally a rebellion.
Exactly, which is why the Tullys were perfect, because the Tullys are not like a massive conquering power, but we've seen how hard it is to overthrow them because of their castle. Like, you can't besiege Riverrun easily. Like, taking out Riverrun is really hard. So they have a very defensible position. Maybe it's hard for them to expand their power, but it's really, like you said, really hard to overthrow them because their position is very defensible. And that was the same, like, to a greater extent, that's true for like the Lannisters. Like, they do have the ability to expand their power because they're so rich and powerful, but it's even harder to overthrow them because their home castle is like, oh my God, how are you gonna overthrow Castle Rock? How are you gonna get in there?
Okay, so here's a thing I wonder: if Harren had established Harrenhal, if Aegon hadn't come along right at that moment. I wonder if it would have significantly changed in the long run, or even the medium run, the nature of the Iron Island Kingdom, because part of why they were who they were is because they had limited resources.
Yeah.
They didn't have a lot of farmlands or forests, so they went out and raided. But if they get this foothold on the main continent, now they got plenty of resources. They don't need to go reaving and raiding and attacking everyone. They can be more centered around trade and stability. And maybe Harren, maybe the next couple generations would have been tyrannical, but maybe eventually they might have shifted their gears. So it would have been better off for them to make alliances and involve themselves in trade and with the powers that be when they're not struggling for resources anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I agree with that. So returning to the question of magic, it's very much an open question, of course. We don't know, but it's super interesting. I really, really wonder how people like the Ghost of Highheart. She wouldn't have been alive in this region, in this era, but like, was there someone living amongst those weirwood stumps? Were they seeing visions, or was that out there for someone to potentially have tapped into? Were the others active in this time? Probably not. But this may have been the time when they were starting to awaken. I mean, you sleep for 8,000 years. Maybe it takes you 200 years to fully wake up. So the time frame's a little different. Our relative understanding of time is different, right? When you exist on a different timeline like that. So, let's take our mid-roll here. We've been at it for a bit, and it's time to take care of a little business, and then we'll get back to our next region. Just Reds pointed out that in the Game of Thrones RPG video game that came out in 2012, that George had some writing hand on. He did involve himself a little bit on this. One of the playable characters is a Westerlands lord, Alistair Sarwick of Riverspring, who is a Red Priest of R'hllor, who came back to Westeros after 15 years of exile after Robert's Rebellion and just before the events of A Game of Thrones. So we were talking last week about the lack of Red Priests and you know how they were coming back in again, and this was something we kind of forgot about, and this is interesting because, yeah, Shay and I played this game.
This game was really hard.
It was really hard. Yeah, the action stuff was just too much for us. We couldn't get past certain things.
Yeah, it was like button mashing.
Yeah. So that's not the most fun thing, button mashing. So one of your tasks as a Red Priest is to reestablish yourself as heir to these lands so that you can then spread the light of R'hllor in the West, in the Westerlands, which is kind of neat. So there's if you play the game right, you end up getting a bunch of R'hllor followers in the West by the time, Dany comes or whatever. Although I don't think the game actually goes to the time when Dany comes, but we certainly didn't get that far. So that's pretty cool. And
there's the fire Skype.
Yeah, there's the ability to communicate with other Red Priests in that game through fire, which I don't know if that's a relevant thing for something.
Well, it was relevant in that we were talking last week about the idea of R'hllor priests communicating with each other or with the home base through glass candles or through other fire type methods.
Right. But I don't think that's not what the game was doing. So I don't know if that's relevant here, but it might be.
But it does show some ideas that George has, right? He did have this idea. We were wondering how much the growth of R'hllor was from the perspectives that we were seeing. But this is like another perspective that maybe we're not seeing in the main series, but from George's perspective in this world, he wants to be growing R'hllor even in Westeros.
Yeah.
And I was also wondering, it seems common in the real world for religions to splinter, to subsects, to varying degrees. And it seems to happen more the older they are, when R'hllor is very old. But as far as we can tell in the book, there don't seem to be splintering. So I was wondering what's keeping them so cohesive, and maybe the ability to communicate through fire is what does it.
Could be.
Churches and temples in different lands can keep on the same page by the same visions that they're all seeing or sending out or whatever,
Right on. Adam Z writes in from the UK to point to the hammer will fall on the dragon prophecy that comes up early in Fire and Blood as a possible example of an Andal prophecy. We said we hadn't heard of any Andal prophecies. Now, that one isn't explicitly Andal, but we don't know where it came from. And given hammer falling on dragon, it sounds like a win for the Andals. Like the hammer defeats the dragon. The hammer is a symbol of the smith. In the Seven. Now, of course, this context is different from the way this plays out. We'll discuss that another time. But just from a high-level view, hammer beating dragon does sound like it could be an Andal prophecy because
I guess I would have assumed it was
sort of wish
Valyrian.
fulfillment. What's that?
I guess I would have assumed it was a Valyrian prophecy.
I would probably have too, but it's when
and we don't know it's a Valyrian prophecy. It's part of what he's saying, but so
I would have assumed that too because most prophecies do seem to be Valyrian or from fire magic or
it's like
from the old
Valyria
gods.
has an association with prophecy, and this is about dragons, so it's about something relevant to Valyria as well.
Yeah,
so
that's true because, like for example, the gold of Castle Rock will destroy, will bring the doom to Valyria. That's another one that's like a warning prophecy pointed at Valyria. It came from Valyria, presumably. So, yeah. Again, we don't know where this one came from. I sort of agree with you, Shay. There's a good chance this is just another Valyrian prophecy because that's where most of them seem to come from. And given that there aren't other Andal prophecies that we know of, we would need more evidence to be sure that this one is. But nevertheless, if anything is an Andal prophecy, it could be this one. So, good call, Adam Z. Thanks for the letter. Adriana DH says, I don't think Eternal Summer is as bad as Eternal Winter. We talked about the difference there last time with R'hllor. She grew up where it's essentially summer all the time. Millions of people live in an in-year-round summer on Earth. It's fine. Even in Westeros, 15 years of summer in a row is fine, as long as there wasn't a war. No one says, summer is coming. That's a good point. No one says, summer is coming. Yeah, I guess maybe in Death Valley they say that. But yeah, not a lot of people live there, so... She says, I also used to think that 6-word story about baby shoes was terribly sad. Then I had kids. It's a real thing that kids sometimes outgrow clothing and shoes before they've actually had a chance to wear them. And so she no longer finds the story so sad. Yeah. Actually, thank you for that. That does make the story less sad.
Yeah, I've read that online from different people as well. They're like, yeah, I had the same thing happen to me. My kid just never got to wear them.
You don't have to assume the worst. Yeah. But we were, yes. It's funny how those of us who are not parents are like, oh my God, that's awful. And they're like, parents are like, nah, it's not that bad. It's only like a 1 in 1,000 chance it's death. It's probably actually just it doesn't fit. Don't worry about it. It's more mundane than you think. So yeah, thanks for the reality check there, Adriana. But yeah, that's a good point about summer and winter as well. Yeah. Permanent winter is like Antarctica. No one lives there. Permanent summer is like the tropics. Some people really like that.
I guess it somewhat depends on what summer is.
Yeah,
what is summer in Westeros?
Turn up the tropics another 10 degrees and maybe not,
But I mean technically maybe people live in desert areas with summer all year long too.
Yeah,
and
that's
they make it work. Yeah. So it's not inhabitable entirely.
It's a good point. Yeah, if it's so hot that it turns the place into a desert eventually, then that's as bad as winter.
Eternal Summer in Dorne might be a lot worse than Eternal Summer in King's Landing.
Yeah, that's
for
true.
example.
I guess it's worth noting summer. I mean, first of all, the seasons in general are more about the positioning of the sun than anything. But we seem to be talking about summer in terms of how hot it is. But a bigger factor in climate or survivability is rainfall. That's the thing that matters. Is there enough rain to support? Yeah. It's not the temperature in the Sahara and the Amazon is about the same, but one has water and one doesn't. That's what really matters.
Yeah, good point. Great point. Thanks for the letter, Adriana. From Pam Plain and Tall regarding Taoism, which is another religion that gives us an example of light and dark and opposites. We talked a lot about that last time with R'hllor. She says, here's a quote that, a poem, I guess it is, that indicates that. When people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. Being and non-being create each other. That definitely touches on some of the stuff we were talking about last time. Right, Sean?
It does, but I still have the same, opinion. The idea that you need evil in order to have good. I mean, I don't think that's completely wrong, but I also don't think it's that simple. I think it's a little pessimistic to say when you see something ugly, it means other things, or when you see something beautiful, it means other things are ugly. I don't think that that's not true. But you could also say when you see something as beautiful, it means something else is gorgeous, and something else is pretty, and something else is cute, and something else is sexy. It's not just binary, beautiful or ugly. There's a range of how you can perceive things. Point. And you could also have 1,000 beautiful things and one ugly thing. It doesn't mean we can't have beautiful. Does that make sense? I don't think it's as simple as one is good and one is bad and they're equal.
It's a great point because if it's like light and darkness, well, that's like black. That in a sense, that's black and white thinking, right? There has to be, and in A Song of Ice and Fire, we certainly emphasize the grays. Which is, this isn't saying those things don't exist, but it's still a philosophical point, and I agree with bringing it up as an example that fits.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the sentiment and the thought, and even the thoughts it sparks in me. But I also just think that within light and dark, there's light blue and dark blue, and light red and dark red.
To be fair, she also used the you're right. To be fair, she also used the example of the since the Tao, this is Taoism. Look at the yin yang symbol with the black. Mm-hmm. The yin and the yang each have a little bit of the other color in them. There's the black, but it has the white dot, and so they're not full. That is to kind of represent the gray. I think I'm not super up on my Taoism, but I believe that's part of what's being represented. She also used the example of Wheel of Time, because the Wheel of Time has the black and white pairing as well as a symbol for the White Tower. The Aes Sedai have that sigil, so that's cool. Another nice little catch there. A little fantasy crossover. George is certainly a fan of Wheel of Time. All right, let's move on to the Stormlands, one of the larger figures of this era, King Argilac the Arrogant. Let's hear what was going on in the kingdom of the Stormlands during this time.
The kingdom of the Storm shrank, king by king, battle by battle, year by year. The fall was halted briefly when a fierce warrior prince, Argilac, called the Arrogant, donned the stag's crown, but even a man as mighty as he could only stay the tide, not turn it back. Last of the Storm Kings, last of the Durrandon, Argilac did just that for a time.
So yeah, this is a big deal. Argilac, the Stormlands were a fading kingdom. They had become powerful. As I said, they had conquered the whole Riverlands, and then they lost that 100 years back, and that decline was continuing. They not only lost the Riverlands, but their borders were being pushed back in a couple different places. And as it says, Argilac turned that tide because he was such a great leader. He was such a strong, charismatic, smart leader. Imagine Robert, but a lot smarter, right? That's kind of what Argilac was, but also probably a bigger jerk. Not as friendly either, a little more ruthless. Because Robert was kind of a passive leader in times of non-war, whereas Argilac sounds like he was just fierce all the time, no matter what job, whatever role he was playing as battle commander or, king of administration or king of on the battlefield, whichever it was, he was aggressive and proud and, well, like his name says, arrogant. So as of the conquest, he's old and gray and was feared and successful in his time. So this is probably the in-between his prime and his fading years, as we'll call them. So he's probably not old and gray yet, but he's definitely not at his peak, 5 to 10 years right before this. That his peak was probably more like 20, 25 years before the conquest. You go ahead.
Well, I realize I'm not clear on how the conquest went down with the Stormlands. Did he bend the knee? Were they?
Oh, he died in battle.
Yeah, there was like
the last storm. He fought.
Was there a siege outside the castle? Am I remembering?
No,
right?
He came out. He emerged. He didn't want to do a siege, especially because they had a dragon. So he led his army out and fought Orys and Rhaenys. And Rhaenys, it was raining, so the dragon wasn't as effective as normal, but still very effective. And Orys decided to order his men to stand aside after it was near the end, and fought Argilac in single combat and beat him. So it really emphasized, it was a symbolic victory. And
how old was Orys?
Aegon's age-ish, 28.
So it seems like kind of a ceremonial thing. If Argilac was like in his senior years, yes, then probably it was just...
And he had already been fighting and was already wounded, and Orys wasn't. Although Argilac still wounded Orys. So he was... Yeah. If they had both been fresh, Argilac still might have won. Like, this guy was a real beast of the battlefield. Real tough guy to fight. And he had that Baratheon temper, because some of the moves he made in this battle, despite being smart, were not smart. Like, he did some of these... But these are things we'll cover when we get to the actual conquest. He had a daughter, Princess Argella, who Orys married afterwards, took her as his bride and continued the dynasty through him. She was also stubborn, proud, and brave like so many other Durrandons before. But it's interesting that she was unmarried and young, where he's this old man. So it kind of implies that he either had other children that died younger, like he outlived, or he remarried. But we don't know if he had a wife at this point. She was not in the picture or not mentioned. So, yeah, he may have had sons or nephews. And now he went, as we said, he led an army into the disputed lands in his some 20 years before the conquest, 25 years before the conquest, during the Century of Blood. So he was part of the reason the Volantines were stopped. So was Aegon. It's kind of funny. They didn't work together, but they both fought against Volantis in different battles to stop Volantis's imperial ambitions. But he was playing like Robert Baratheon. Remember what Robert says to Ned? He's like, we should just get out. Let's just leave and just go be sellswords and just go fight, by our strength of arms and just live that way. Argilac led his army into the disputed lands, which is the haunt of sellswords, right? It says he did it for golden glory. So it's like he went and did something a sellsword captain would do, led his army into the disputed lands and fought against like this foreign army just to make some cash and because he liked the action,
Part of me wonders if Robert might have been inspired by that, but another part of me thinks Robert probably didn't learn about that.
Yeah, Robert, probably, that's history.
Even if someone taught him, he wasn't paying attention.
He might have heard a little bit about this. He would have paid attention during the battle parts. He's like, oh, he did wait. Okay, tell me about that part. But yeah, the whole he would have fallen asleep during the going across the water and how all that was accomplished. But then like once the battle starts again, he's like, all right, I'm interested. Did he have a big hammer or did he use what did he wield? So most of the political dealings that the Durrandons would have had in this era would have been with the Reach, Dorne, Harren the Blacks, and maybe Halleck before, depending on who was older, Argilac or Harren the Black, and narrow sea powers like the Free Cities and the Pirates of the Stepstones. So those would have been his people that he was dealing with. And in Dorne was the Yellow Toad, and the Reach was Mern. And interestingly, he killed a king of the Reach in battle when he was younger as well. So this is another feather in this guy's cap, a real badass. He's also the guy who gave Princess Meria her nickname, the Yellow Toad. He's credited with that. So, hey, he also is clever? I don't know. Nina says it's important to note that the Durrandon kingdom was at a nadir of a few centuries of decline by the time of Argilac's reign. At the dynasty's acme under Arlen III, the Durrandons had controlled an empire that stretched from the Neck in the north to the Dornish Marches in the south and from Tarth all the way to Ironman's Bay in the west. But after the death of Arlen III, it just was eaten away by gardeners, martells, whores until this point, until it was all their conquests were gone and they were reduced to their original region, and it started to lose some of that. It was Arak who we mentioned as the last king, the last storm king of the Riverlands. That was Argilac's grandfather, so it was his own grandfather that lost the Riverlands and lost them to House Hor, who he's now anxious about. If some of you may recall your conquest lore, Argilac tried to broker a deal with Aegon where he married his daughter to Aegon and got the Blackwater and gave Aegon the Blackwater as a dowry. It was like, well, that's a big gift, but it wasn't his. He was giving lands away that weren't his. So what he was trying to do is to create a buffer state between. He's like, I'm going to put the Dragon Lord in between my borders and the Iron King's borders, so that if he's coming to march south, he has to go through the Dragon Lord first to get to me. But he did this very like ham-fistedly, and Aegon was like, I see what you're doing. So yeah, it didn't work. Would have worked great if it did work, but there was pretty much no way it was going to work. Yeah, so this is a very interesting character. Lots of war, lots of pushback, lots of fighting, and also not very popular though. Like he was a warrior king. Like within his own domain, he was popular. He wasn't hated by his own. But as I said, he killed a Reach King in battle, so they weren't big fans. And obviously, Argilac was no fan of Harren the Black, so they weren't on good terms. Any last thoughts on Argilac or the Stormlands? Any other questions there?
Maybe just point out the irony that they seem to be struggling before the conquest, and now eventually their leader became the king,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, very true. Okay, the North. Let's talk about the North. Yes, this is a particularly interesting one. The last known ruler was King Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt, the one who, when faced with Aegon and his dragons, decided to kneel. And that's a little unusual because of the general disposition of Stark kings and lords as one of toughness, one of not bending the knee, one of independence. Robb Stark, at a provocation, declared independence. It was a severe provocation, but you see that they were, he was ready to do that. Of course, it was the Great John's idea, but everyone got behind it. It was like, yeah, what a great idea. So Torrhen maybe was a little more thoughtful, a little more forward-thinking than a lot of other Stark rulers. Unfortunately for him, his decision to kneel would have some fallback or pushback from his constituents because they expected the Stark to be a little tougher about it, to at least go down fighting. But that, again, is which tells us a lot about the state of affairs 15 years before that happened. The North has kind of been what it's been. They don't...
Yeah, there might have been some pushback if he hadn't been the knee also. There would have been at least some people... I guess some people might have been upset that, our fields are burned, our town is destroyed, or if not pushback, they would have just been dead. The people that were pushing back, you shouldn't have done that, would have been dead. They wouldn't be alive to push back. So, I don't know. I'm totally behind Torrhen Stark's knee bending in this scenario.
Yeah, I mean, from a purely, could he have won point of view, no.
Yeah.
No.
I think it's just stubbornness and arrogance among people in power, that they are not thinking about the lives of their people when they want him to stand up to a dragon.
So Aegon only took 10,000 or so, 15,000 men to the Field of Fire, where the Lannisters and Reachmen brought 55,000 men. Aegon had already gotten the submission of the Crownlands, the Stormlands, and of course the Riverlands as well, and parts of and the Vale by this point,
and effectively the Iron Islands.
Right, but he only brought 15,000 men. He could have brought a lot more. And this is just a puzzling question. Why didn't he bring more? Well, the reason I think my headcanon is because he knew he didn't need them, and he wanted to prove how deadly the dragons were in battle. He's like, look, they have 4 times as many men as we are, and we beat them badly. Why? Obviously because of the dragons. That sends the message. You and me and Ashay were all sitting here like, why would they even fight the dragons in the first place? Because they didn't know. It had been hundreds of years since armies faced dragons. They didn't know. They have this natural pride, their arrogance even. You don't bend the knee so lightly. They've had these kingdoms for thousands of years. You don't give up so easily. Once the reality of facing dragons got out, it's like, okay, maybe you do bend the knee. One of them burnt Harrenhal. The gardeners were entirely wiped out on the Field of Fire. And so let me like, why? And that's what Torrhen was faced with. He's like, okay,
yeah.
Because when Aegon brought his army north and Torrhen brought his army south, Aegon had more men than Torrhen. So he brought all those men. He had more men and all 3 dragons, whereas he had just beaten all the West and the Gardeners badly outnumbered. This time he was outnumbering the Starks. So the Starks okay, so he beat a much bigger army with a lesser army. Now he has triple that amount, which is more than I have, and he still has the dragon. So yeah. Wisdom maybe is selling it short because in some ways it's just blatant. It's obvious. His scouts also saw Harrenhal and oh my God, look at that. It's burned. It was still smoking, they say. It was still smoldering weeks later.
Here's a couple thoughts stirring in me about this. One, going back to your board game analogy,
yeah.
Right? That a lot of times in a multiplayer, strategy type game, where when one person starts to get a significant advantage, other people team up against them, and it kind of restabilizes. And someone can have an advantage, But if someone starts to get enough of an advantage to take out their neighbors team up against them, right?
Yeah.
But the difference is in a board game, everyone has semi-perfect information. Everyone can see everything in everyone's kingdom and what's going on.
How many pieces on the board they have,
Right. In the real world, the people, even the soldiers, the king, they can't necessarily see the supply lines and resources of the other side. When they can, a lot of times they make better decisions. That's why you have scouts. That's why you have intelligence and so on. And so kind of like the dragon, you can't see, when you're thinking about how to deploy your army, you're thinking about what you've done in the past. You're thinking about what the gardeners have or the Starks have or whatever. And you're like, they have this many troops and this cavalry, we'll go to this hill. But none of this is accounting for what the dragon's going to do. And they're just not doing that.
Yeah.
And at some point, they probably should have. And Torrhen Stark did. This is making me think about like World War I, when they're just not used to like trench warfare and machine guns. And they're just like suiciding troops in. And when we look back at that, we think of the terrible tragedy it was, not the proud leaders. We're thinking about the naive, stubborn, irresponsible leaders that should have handled things differently.
Yeah, should have adopted new
whether it's surrendering or a new strategy or anything, but they just were not realizing the reality of what's happening on the battlefield right now. And countless people died because of it. Torrhen Stark prevented that.
That is a really good analogy, because the kings of West and Reach were like, no, we gotta, of course we can win. Like we'll get to Mern in a minute, but he was so arrogant that he brought his entire family to the battlefield. Like not the women, but like his grandsons were squires, and like he wanted them all in the front. It was like, this is dumb, man, dumb. But sticking with Torrhen. Yeah. An interesting factor about him, kind of an under the radar quality that adds to the mystique or the idea that this was an intelligent guy. He got his army together really fast, and it was big. Remember how Robb was in a hurry and he got together about 18,000 men? Torrhen was in a hurry as well, and he got together 30,000. That implies A, probable experience at having done this before, which Robb hadn't, clearly. B, maybe just a natural talent for it. Like he's good at logistics, administrative stuff, and you're always someone that values that. So this is probably noteworthy. Like how do you get all the North is so big, getting all those men together, armed and equipped, and having enough food, and then marching south and all that. It's
the
really...
North being more populated that much in the past seems strange to me too. So but that would be my thought, was that maybe like there were more fighting men available to him straight up.
That's possible, but probably not that many.
Yeah,
more,
exactly. That's why I'm like, it's so many. I can't imagine like there was that. I mean, maybe there was. Maybe one of those sicknesses came through and they really wiped out the population in the North along with other places, and there really are fewer people that live in the North in Robb's time than there were in Torrhen's. Like I feel like that is possible. I don't think that accounts for the whole thing, but like maybe 5,000 people or something.
Yeah.
I think it's possible, but even with that, I still don't think it just naturally populations increase over time.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it would be weird to me.
When two people have 3 kids, and then each of those have 3 kids, like maybe the average is lower than 3.
There could be setbacks,
but in the past, averages were higher in general than they are now.
That's
population. I mean, just for all of history, the population keeps growing and growing.
That's true.
So
for most places,
there could be little moments. But
it's also true that there could be the population has grown in other places and not in the North necessarily as much.
Here's another factor I think that should be considered. Let me throw this at you guys. This is an independent North. There may be more national pride in what is a fight for their independence, which was what Robb was doing as well. But this was declaring independence, where they had been under the Iron Throne for 300 years at that point, and things were fine. They weren't like, this Iron Throne has been ruling us badly for 300 years. No, they had done fine under the Targaryens. It was obviously killing Ned was a reason for them to get mad, but that wasn't necessarily a reason to throw off the whole thing.
And there might have also just been, and for Torrhen, more of an impetus on like, this is the end all be all. We all have to go. Whereas for Robb, people were like, maybe half of us should stay back.
Yeah.
There might have been some people who just didn't go because,
and again, given
it was super dire.
Yeah. And again, given the pushback against Torrhen's decision to kneel, you could see that a lot of people wanted to fight. Like there were a lot of them were like, damn it, we should have fought. Like even with seeing the dragons and being outnumbered, they still wanted to fight. They were still upset that he knelt. So that implies there was a energy. Like a lot of people were up for this fight, you know.
I see Dornish Dame does point out, by the way, that I was thinking, I was like, the North lost fighting men between Robert's Rebellion and the Greyjoy Rebellion, and then like that, I considered Robert's Rebellion, but I'd forgotten that the Greyjoy Rebellion probably would have culled the numbers of fighting people.
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit. Whereas before the conquest, there maybe wasn't anything.
Hadn't the North also been in wars before the
conquest?
The conquest also? Wasn't there the Worthless War?
The Worthless War had been an on and off thing, and it's unclear exactly when it ended. But yeah, that would have probably not ended that long before. And again, if we're looking at Torrhen's ability, if we're saying, wow, he got his men together really quick, one of my points was it implies he's done it before. He probably didn't call the banners just as an exercise, although in those other times. So
maybe he just already had an
there
army
must have been
standing.
some kind of... What's that?
Maybe you hit on something accurate there. That maybe he just had a standing army, kind of close to ready. Some of them.
He was more. Yeah, he kept them more ready. Like he was more.
Like he might have just like 2 years ago gone to war and been like, okay, well, let me hit up the same people. You know,
he may have even seen something like this coming. He may have been like, okay, it's only these Dragon Lords. Is that what you were going to say, Sean?
Yes, I was going to say part of logistics is planning.
Yeah,
and this isn't as sudden as what happened with Ned and Aegon, right?
Yeah.
I think that he and the other people of the North might have realized this thing. It may have had years to like see this coming and be thinking about how to respond and what to do, and mobilizing food trains and armaments and sentiment and so on.
Just because some of the other kings didn't see it coming doesn't mean he didn't. Yeah, Torrhen maybe.
Even if he had a standing army, like Ashay is saying, that's still logistics. He still had to organize those soldiers and keep them fed and armed. And I think almost any angle you look at this, it came down to him being better prepared logistically.
Yeah. And then which is kind of ironic, he was better prepared logistically to march that big old army down there and just not fight, which still, that was the correct play. But, I mean, the kneeling part. But it's a very interesting story going forward. This thing we'll have to cover separately as well, which is this reaction in the North. That'll be a fun thing to cover when we talk about the conquest from the North's perspective and the events that come afterwards. So let's talk about the Worthless War for a minute here. This is also called the War over the Water, which was the very long, so-called 1,000-year battle. Probably not quite that long. Probably not even close. Probably hundreds of years. And it would be an off-and-on thing. But, it's possible they first started fighting over 1,000 years before. Was the sisters. The three sisters in the Bight. The control over the sisters. The sisters themselves are not very strong. But kind of like the Stepstones, it's not the location, it's not the islands themselves, but where the islands are. The person that controls the sisters has the better ability to control piracy in the region. The Starks, of course, had a vested interest in controlling piracy in that region because that's where White Harbor is. It's very important for them. And the Vale wanted to control it because, they have Gulltown farther south and a lot of settlements in the north there. And also just because, they wanted to fight over it. The Starks wanted it and the Arryns wanted it. And no one knew how to give up. Eventually the Stark did just kind of go, why are we fighting over this? This is worthless, right? Perhaps the geopolitical situation shifted enough that they just didn't need to fight over. And they're like, yeah, why are we doing this?
Yeah, sometimes the word worthless it doesn't necessarily mean not worth anything. It means worth less than what we've put into it.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be the case.
Chasing a sunk cost in this case, yeah. So that's a whole nother topic. Well, maybe we'll cover the War over the Water separately at some point. It was a brutal and vicious and a lot of back and forth, Starks and Arryns, though. It's kind of interesting in that sense because you don't see there's not a lot of examples of Stark versus Arryn. So on the wall, we have, it's worth checking in on the wall at this point. The last known Lord Commander, very interesting, son of Halak-Hor, brother to Harren the Black. Yeah, so Harren the Black's brother was Lord Commander when the conquest happened, which means maybe he wasn't at this point, but he probably was, given how old Harren was.
How did he get to be on the wall?
We don't know. Our guess is, I'll go with Nina's guess, which is that she thinks, well, I'll read what she wrote. I'd wonder whether Harren himself exiled his brother to the Watch in order to eliminate competition. if Urathon the Fourth Good Brother was willing to put his brother's sons to the sword in order to secure his Kingsmoot election, this is nothing compared to that. This is sending someone to the wall is nothing like killing them. And this would be a way to avoid, the Kinslayer charge or what have you, which is a pretty big deal, even among the Ironborn, especially because he's trying to rule non-Ironborn. So he doesn't want to look like a cursed ruler, even if he doesn't believe in that. No reason for the political negativity there. So it could have been a rival. He could have seen him as a rival. I mean, a lot of these like ruthless, powerful power brokers think everyone else is just as ruthless and powerful and power hungry as they are. So anyone with your bloodline is a potential threat. So this is. Go ahead.
I don't know, just wondering along this lines, I wonder how much, if maybe what was the name of the brother that went to the wall?
We don't know.
Oh, we don't even know.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder if he might have been, I don't know, had some motivation like Jon, where like, yeah, you'll go up there for honor or whatever,
you'll have a chance
to fight the wildlings. Yeah, like, and also I wonder if maybe on some level it might have been a political move. If it might have endeared him a little to the North. If the North might have been a little more okay with, yeah, Harren, go ahead, build your castle. We're not worried about you.
He's not as direct a threat to them. Yeah.
You've made peace with us by sending your brother up to the wall.
That's something. It's something. Yeah, and
almost like a marriage. Not as quite as strong or as impactful, but along that line.
And you wonder what he himself thought about this brother. But we know that he did nothing. He did what the Night's Watch is supposed to do. He didn't. He had 10,000 swords. So the Night's Watch was a lot bigger in this era. And he didn't come do anything. He didn't bring his men south or anything when the conquest broke out, even when his brother was being attacked, which is correct. That's what the Night's Watch is supposed to do. He may have been happy to do nothing. He'd been like, I hate my brother. I'm definitely not doing it. I wouldn't have done any, even if it was allowed. Which is ironic, though, because Aegon's conquest is the beginning of the end for the wall in terms of a source of manpower, because one of the biggest sources of manpower for the wall was the endless wars between these other kingdoms, where a lot of the losers would end up getting sent to the wall. The king's peace ironically reduced the wall's manpower. It was a good thing.
And the quality of their manpower, because yes, fighting men being sent there versus just criminals.
Instead of both.
Yeah, instead of both.
Yeah, it becomes almost like 9 out of 10 are criminals instead of half or 4 out of 10 or something. Yeah. Good points, y'all. Very good points. Let's talk about the Vale. The Vale. Last known ruler would have been, well, we don't know the name, Lord Arryn, but the husband of Shar Arryn, who was, quote, the flower of the mountain. She's queen regent for her son, young Ronal Arryn, at the conquest. Ronal was young enough to sit on Visenya's knee during the conquest, implying he's quite young, 7, 8. What does that say to y'all when you hear sitting on someone's knee?
No older than 8, probably.
Yeah,
that would be my guess. For a boy, usually, that would just be my guess. I would say probably between 5 and 8.
He goes, "Mother, can I ride the dragon? Can I ride the And the mother's like, she's like, yes, and then she surrenders. She's like, okay, I get it. It's symbolic, like, Visenya, you've got my son in your lap. Like, yes, you win.
Yeah, for example, I don't think I sat on Santa's lap at 9, but I did at 7.
Because the wiki, technically the wiki, it's possible for him to be as old as like 17. But if you're 17 sitting on Visenya's lap saying, I want to ride the dragon, it takes on a whole new meaning.
Robin might have sat on Lysa's lap.
I cannot believe the wiki says that Ronal Arryn could have been 17.
Yeah, well, they don't know where to cut it off.
They don't know where. There's some line somewhere, but I think 17 is well past.
Way too high, yeah.
I mean, if you think it could be 17, why not 19 or 21?
Well, that's impossible because of, I think, certain other factors. I think 17 is the upper limit based on other. I can't think of why, but yeah. But yeah, so I think so. I think 7 or 8.
I think definitely 10. Like, I think there's no chance that they were above 10, and I do think 8 is more like 9. But like, I had no chance over 10-year-old boy. I don't know.
Also, it's worth noting the other end of the spectrum. Like a 2-month-old baby, you can't really sit on your lap. You would be held in your arms.
Or say, "Mother, I want to."
Well, yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
like a 4-year-old struggles with speaking so clearly as that either. So I think at least 5. I think probably 5 to 8.
Yeah.
A 4-year-old, I think you're underestimating kids.
I've been around some 4-year-olds recently, and I don't think they speak as clearly as being quoted as "Mother, can I please ride the dragon?" You know,
this is the future king of the Vale you're speaking of,
like,
not just some.
It's going to be a little more childish. I don't know. Like I feel like 5-year-olds I've interacted with can speak more clearly than. I don't know. There's some.
I have a niece that's 2, and you would be amazed.
Okay.
You know, like she was standing on a fox, like a stuffed fox, and my dad asked her, "Are you going to hurt the fox?" She's like, "No, the fox is my platform." So, yeah, she might be an advanced 2-year-old, but
yeah. So he also had a younger brother. Unfortunately, this younger brother would be used against him later in a Aaron versus Aaron civil war, and it got ugly. But this younger brother is named Jonos. He's kind of our marker, because if Shara is regent, that means her husband, Lord Aaron, died. But he couldn't have died that long ago if Jonos, Aaron, this younger brother, this younger son exists, right? So he had to have died in between Shara being pregnant with Jonos and sometime after that. So my guess is that 15 years prior to the conquest, King Aaron was alive and well and married to Shara, who would have been 22. So they're probably married by that point. But fast forward maybe 5-10 years later, and in between that, he's passed. But they've gotten these 2 sons in between as well. And maybe it's like a Jon Arryn situation. It is like a Jon Arryn situation, because you have a regent and a young son who was in charge. But what I mean in this particular case is that maybe Shara wasn't King Aaron's first wife, just like Lysa wasn't Jon Arryn's first wife. But it is the first person he had kids with, or at least ones that survived. So they also could have possibly had children before Jonos and Ronald that just died, and Ronald was the oldest boy that lived. But these are the standard guesses about families and stuff. So she sounds really interesting, Shara Aaron. Remember that when the conquest was announced, she offered herself to Aegon as a 3rd wife, as long as Ronald was named heir to the Iron Throne. Well, there was no Iron Throne. As long as Ronald was named heir to Aegon. This is a bit outrageous as an ask. Now you can say she's trying to, it's like a negotiation. You ask for a lot, settle in the middle, maybe. But remember what we're partly trying to get at is what kind of person this was. Even though it has yet to happen in the timeline that we're talking about, this offer, it says a lot about her as a person, I think. It's also a little less outrageous than it sounds. Aegon, at age 27, with 2 wives, had no kids. Maybe he was never going to have kids. Maybe he was infertile. Maybe he was sterile. Maybe both his wives were infertile. That's less likely, but something may be up, right? That's going to make some people scratch their heads and go, he's 27 with 2 wives and doesn't have a kid yet. That's very interesting. So she's like saying, and of course she's not saying, make my son heir no matter what. She understands that in that scenario, if he has a trueborn child with his queen, one of his queens, then that kid jumps to the front of the line as far as successor. But if she's one of those 3 queens, that might be her kid. So she might get the heir either way, right? So obviously it'd be great for her if this was offered. And she might be thinking, yeah, and because those other 2 haven't born him any sons, I have had kids. Maybe this will really work. So she's considering all the angles here. It looks like a great move for her. But of course, Aegon's like, no, that's not going to happen. 2 wives is enough. I don't ally. I dominate. That's consistently his position on things. He's like, no, I don't have allies. I have subjects. Everyone who offered to ally with him, he's like, no. Like, you want to fight Harren? I'll help you beat Harren. He's like, no. You can help me beat Harren, but as my vassal. But we're not allying. We're not equals. So, but the thing about this that makes it even more outrageous and says something about her personality is that the Vale is the hotbed of 7 worship. It's the place where the 7 first landed in Westeros. She's offering herself to be part of a polygamous marriage to dragon lords. The Andals hate the dragon lords. That's who drove them out. A lot of their cultural heritage is running away from dragon lords and their enslavement, and a lot of their cultural tenets are exactly the opposite of Valyrian cultural ideals. So the Faith, had this happened, which of course it didn't, the Faith would probably not have been chill with that arrangement. They've been like, what now? Excuse me? Yeah, the Lady of the Vale's doing what?
Yeah, they might have been like, yeah, those Targaryens, those are like heathens. Who cares, really what they're doing. Oh, wait, a good God-fearing, like seven-fearing, faith woman?
Yeah, that was
doing that, that's too far.
I wonder how that might have gone. I wonder if the seven would have, if the religious leaders of the seven would have had to come around and accept it, or if they would have been eliminated. If they tried to resist, if Aegon were like, all right, we're going to go burn all the steps down with our dragons now. We'll teach you. You can find some new religion or accept us.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. Like, she's the consideration, the angles that Shara has here. A, she can, insert herself into the royal family. B, she can ally with see which way the wind is blowing and ally with or at least get on the good side of the people who are likely to win, side with the winners. That's a standard power move. And she can also see, though, despite the strength of the Dragon Lords here, given the situation with lack of children, she could also see where just like an arrow here or there, or a poison or something, a faceless man that would be the end of it. They don't have kids. They don't have this power, this emerging power could just collapse all of a sudden due to lack of like heirs or just a key person dying. So she's also taking a significant gamble by trying to jump on this bandwagon. So she's a brave. I say this is a bold choice. This is a bold woman willing to make a lot of power moves, willing to be very pragmatic, willing to mix it up, willing to sacrifice a lot to do anything, like willing to give up things that are important to her to come out on top, which is a power player, real Game of Thrones-er.
Sucks to have this scenario where just, marriages and children or how we pick our leaders out, or they or us in the past or whatever. But given that, it is a good play for her to make, and it is a sacrifice she's willing to make. So on. By the way, what if Aegon had died? What if he did get sick or fall off his dragon or something like that?
That's a big what if.
How would power? I'm guessing one of the wives,
Visenya, was the elder,
married someone else and their kid, and it would have gone on. It wouldn't just been the end of it all right there, right?
Yeah. Yes, you're right. Like Visenya would have been the Lady of Dragonstone, and she would have probably taken a husband, probably a Valarian, but maybe someone else. Maybe she would have seen no reason to marry someone else for power reasons or whatever.
Eventually, they did have kids, so they weren't infertile. Right.
Each one of them had one. Yes.
But what if they had been?
Well, there are theories about about that as well.
Yeah, there are theories that neither of those kids are legitimate.
Yeah, they would still be Targaryens because they would still be Rhaenys' and Visenya's respectively, but aren't necessarily Aegon's, is the theory.
Yeah, because
or other variations on that.
Rhaenys surrounded herself with handsome men. So there's and Visenya dabbled in black magic and didn't have Maegor until she was like 38 or 39. So there's and he came out so cruel and twisted and huge and psychopathic. There's a magical origin behind that. Maybe there's some dark, she used a little magic to make that happen or something.
It seems like George at least wants to keep those doors open.
Yes,
for something along that line to happen. I also had thought that the fact that they hadn't had kids yet might be an indication that the marriage is not out of love as much as tradition or power monopolization or something like that.
Well, it's well known that he married Rhaenys for love. That would have been well known, but still wasn't having a kid with her, that's still adds to the whole scenario. He married her for love, so they're probably sleeping together a lot. Still, no kid. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So Nina has another angle here that's interesting. She considers the possibility that Shara may have been thinking, if Aegon accepts this marriage, and the faith gets involved, because, yeah, like we said, they're not chill about it. The way that could play out is, well, she's the only Seven worshiper in the mix here. She should be the wife that counts. She's the one that got married under the auspices of the Seven. The two incestuous queens should be put aside, and the children from her body are the ones that should matter first, no matter what else happens with the other queens. If the faith backing that, it could be
a couple generations later, at least, how that might, if there's some contest for the throne, that there would be some contingency of people that would take that route.
Yeah, and the faith was a big problem 30 years after the conquest. So, and it's actually an interesting question right now. It's actually a question we have coming in a bit. What was the faith doing in this era? They're not a big part of any of this. There's pretty good reasons for that, but we'll come back to that. So what else does this say about Shara? Nina says, I'm so curious to know more about Shara Arryn. Presumably Shara was originally from the Vale since, quote, in her youth, Queen Shara had been lauded as the flower of the mountain. But what family was she from? Given Ronald Arryn's apparently young age at the time of the conquest and the fact that Shara was around 37 during the conquest, it's possible that Shara had not had Ronald till her late 20s, probably not even until her early 30s. And that's a pretty late age for by Westerosi standards to have her eldest child. So, yeah, this is why we theorize maybe there were other kids before, or maybe this was a second marriage for both of them. Who knows? We also wonder how strong her regency position was. Was she constantly battling people trying to marry her like Lysa Arryn was? Like, Lysa Arryn had a lot of suitors for her hand, because whoever marries her gets to rule the Vale kind of as co-regent and be at the Eyrie and all that, and all sorts of maneuvers they can make from that position. And how did she, and was she having to fight to protect her son's position? Because we did see there's uprisings not long after, coming along later, 30 years down the road.
That's another angle maybe that this plan seems kind of half-baked. We spent a lot of time talking about like why I've actually been a good plan, but it still might have seemed like a bad plan to a lot of people, or some of our angles might not have been true, or in her mind, it might have just been a bad plan. But another reason she might have had this plan, even if it wasn't realistic, was like you're saying, just to fight off suitors. She might need a legitimate reason to give to people why she's not marrying them or someone. It's like, oh, I'm angling to marry Aegon, so I can't marry you. I would, but I'm trying to marry Aegon. That's better for my family. I can see that being a motivation she would have.
That
so
makes
something
sense.
to say to people to justify not marrying them.
And we sort of have examples like that. I mean, like Tywin was holding Cersei back to try to marry Rhaegar. He refused a lot of other offers for that reason. So yeah, that's a thing, So going back a little farther in history here, Halleck Hor, father of Harren the Black, had one of the reasons I called him less capable, but just as aggressive as Harwin Hardhand, who was Harren the Black's grandfather, was he tried 3 times. He sent 3 armies up against the Bloody Gate. And if y'all remember your lessons about the Bloody Gate, it's the spot where many other armies have come to die. That's why it's called the Bloody Gate. And in fact, Halleck Hor is one of the reasons it has that reputation. He just didn't talk about not learning. This place is impregnable, but he just kept throwing manpower at it, which is again an example of the style of leadership you see from these Ironborn rulers. They picked up how to manage money and administrative stuff that the older school Ironborn were never good at, but they still ruled through brutality and with a disregard for life that even people like Tywin wouldn't throw lives away like this necessarily. And Tywin was plenty willing to throw lives away. But Tywin wouldn't just throw men at an unbeatable obstacle. He would have the sense to realize this is not going to work. And he probably wouldn't. He may not have even tried in the first place. And he's willing to waste men. We saw that. Like when he was trying to cross the Red Fork and Robb wanted Edmure not to do this, but Edmure set up this great line of defense to stop him from crossing. And so what Tywin did was he sent men all over the place to try to find a weak spot until he found one. And a lot of men died doing that, but it wasn't it wasn't fruitless.
It wasn't pointless. Yeah.
It wasn't impossible.
It might not have been worth it, but it was something that could happen.
Yeah.
With the sacrifice.
It would definitely cost lives, but it wasn't like running into a wall. It wasn't like the wildlings attacking the wall in season 4, where it's like this is hopeless. Even without Stannis, coming in. So yeah, that's those were so she knew where one of the threats was. So she's clearly like, okay, so even though these Ironborn are making foolish attacks, they're trying, and that's dangerous, and they may find another way to do it. And after Harrenhal's established, you got a different king. Their approach may change. They may try different tactics. They may not do this stupid method of the frontal assault on an impregnable castle. They may try finding ways through the mountains or shipping men around the Vale and entering through the fingers or things like that, which might actually work. Shara would be thinking about that as like, this is the next 5 to 10 year outlook. Like, is when Harrenhal's finished, what kind of moves is he going to be making? This is exactly the kind of moves I think she would be thinking of. And if she's not thinking of them, well, maybe she should have been. Maybe one of her advisors would have been thinking of that. So yeah, as Nina puts it, Harren's architectural distraction wouldn't last forever. And when it ended, the Vale might be next on the chopping block. Especially given that a lot of people perceive a kingdom ruled by a woman/boy king as ripe. They would be wrong in this case because she's no pushover, but right, that doesn't just because we know that doesn't mean they know that.
And even if they can't defeat her, it doesn't mean that her people won't be very hurt by the attempt.
Right, like unless it's like Halleck Hor again, smashing their armies fruitlessly against the Bloody Gate that just gives her an easy win, then yeah, it's going to take a lot of effort and tough decisions and loss of life and things like that. So basically, what is that? So decoding her offer, yeah, it's like it tells her that she's a player. It tells us she's a player, right? She's playing the Game of Thrones, and also, but she was willing to fight though, because as soon as we'll see later when Aegon says no. She's like, all right, then. She doesn't cower. She doesn't beg. She doesn't try. She just switches to defend. She's like, all right, gear up. Start arming the men. Increase the garrisons. Start making spears and swords, new arrows and all that. So then, of course, none of that mattered because dragons just flew over that. But so but it's a pattern. Her plan of trying to get a marriage into the Targaryen family is sort of a Aeron recurring feature. A century later, Viserys Targaryen, soon to be played by Paddy Considine, marries Aemma Arryn, that's Rhaenyra's mother, and Aemma herself, 1/4 Targaryen, because she is the granddaughter of Jaehaerys and Alysanne. Her mother was Daella Targaryen, and her father, Daella's husband, was Roderick Arryn.
Yes, her name was Aemma Targaryen, as in A-E, a very Targaryen name, to be clear.
Yeah, not Emma, Aemma.
Yeah.
And another figure worth mentioning is Marla Sunderland. Marla Sunderland is the lady of the sisters, of the 3 sisters, who we just spoke about with regards to the Worthless War. She's probably in charge at this point. When the conquest happens, the Vale loses control of the sisters again. They throw off the yoke of the Vale and declare themselves independent and put Marla Sunderland up as their new queen. And then that gets reversed really quickly when they realize this was a terrible idea. The Targaryens come for them, and they overthrow her themselves before they even get there. Which tells us that maybe this woman was not very forward-thinking, or her supporters weren't very forward-thinking. But this is also a recurring feature, because the Sunderlands also will join the Blackfire Rebellion, and that doesn't go well for them either. So it's kind of a recurring feature, just as much as the Aarons trying to marry the Targaryens is a recurring thing, so are the Sunderlands trying to become independent. The 3 sisters trying to break apart and become a pirate kingdom all again, or whatever they had in mind. The West. There's less information on the West, but we've got a few things. The last known ruler, Loren the First Lannister, a.k.a. Loren the Last, seems to have been on the younger end, didn't have a son until after the conquest. And he had multiple sons, so he was probably a younger king at this point. His nickname, like I said, Loren the Last, because he was the last king of the Rock. He might have been the son of Tommen II, the Tommen who went to Valyria to try to loot the ruins after the Doom. This foolish man who took their Valyrian steel sword with him on this expedition. Why did you take the Valyrian steel sword with you on this expedition? Who were you going to like fight with it? You're going to the volcanic ruin. Like, what enemies are you going to fight with your fancy sword that really shouldn't have? Yeah, this was foolish. So, but
I gotta say, I can't help but think that's results oriented. I think that if he, I don't know, but I think that it seems reasonable to me if you're going on an adventure, you want to bring your best weapon. I don't know. Maybe he shouldn't have gone on this adventure. Maybe this weapon is more important to the family than his success in the adventure.
That might be the better argument.
I don't think
the adventure was the problem in the first place, not the taking your sword with you. But either way, so you wonder,
like, if he had come back with 2 more Valyrian swords that he won by defeating someone with his Valyrian sword, then we would say, "Oh, wow, what a great idea that was! Good thing he took his sword," you know.
But the idea of finding that on the doomed peninsula, yeah, maybe that's a little thin. Yeah. But you're right. I see your point, though. I see your point. Nina writes, I wonder how the fateful voyage of Tommen II affected Loren on a personal as well as political level. Tommen's failure was spectacular. The loss not only of the king, but this fleet and the sword. Did the other powers of Westeros mock the Lannisters for losing all this, for this failure? Because they don't know the circumstances. They don't know, maybe you said, maybe it's results oriented, but that's still how they would probably look at it, as looking at the result. Wrong or right, that's probably what they would do. They're certainly taking advantage to take the Lannisters down a peg. That seems pretty straightforward. So they were like, you idiots, you decadent fools, is the word Nina uses, decadent fools. Yeah, kind of like that.
You know, it just occurred to me, Ned took ice down to King's Landing, didn't he?
No, he didn't. It's too big to wield. It's too big to wield.
How did Tywin get it?
Oh, no, I guess he did bring it. You're right, he did bring it. You're right, he must have.
And that wasn't even some adventure where he expected to go into combat.
You're totally right. Yeah. That was a good point. Okay. I didn't think of that. Good example. Where was I? Yeah, so this is a recent pattern with the Lannisters in this era. What I've noted that it's perhaps the biggest fail in a series of recent fails by recent Lannister kings. They had gone through a phase of marked by extravagance and poor decisions, which I think is a function of the Lannisters had sort of quote unquote learned that they could make a lot of mistakes without suffering many repercussions, given how entrenched their power was, given how hard it is to overthrow them, given how much just wealth they can just literally pull out of the ground, how much wealth they had built up over prior generations and centuries. They could mess up pretty bad and still, at the end of the day, be a king.
The connections they had based on that wealth, too, were also almost as valuable as the wealth.
Yeah, all trade deals.
The power of Lannisport, the commerce that's moving through there.
Tax base, yeah. You're right. There's just so much entrenched power they have. So, yeah, you can make a lot of mistakes in that position. And since your defensive position is also so strong, you can fail and hold on to power. It's an unusual scenario, but you can see why that's the case given the way things were. So, yeah, like the idea of a world without Lannisters ruling in Casterly Rock seemed foreign, especially in the West, but probably seemed pretty weird to anyone in Westeros. Like, no one's ever heard of that. Like, the Casterlys ruled so long ago that it's nowhere near historical memory. So this was, so we didn't have like a lot of forward thinkers. There wasn't like a Lannister king in recent memory at this point that had made a lot of smart moves, at least not that we saw. Just a lot of these fails. So it's not that they didn't have wars, but they were wars of expansion or defense against such. And it was like traditional back and forth fights with their neighbors. For example, we get a general idea from this quote from The World of Ice and Fire.
By the way, just want to clarify those types of conflicts you're describing as opposed to conquest.
Right.
They're not trying to
border skirmishes were super common when these entrenched powers that you're not going to overtake Casterly Rock, you're not going to overtake Highgarden, but you might overtake a castle on the border, and all of a sudden that passes from the west to the Reach or back and forth. There's certain border spots that must have traded hands just countless times over the years.
But as opposed to like the
full-blown conquest of the Riverlands by the Stormlands.
The horrors who took
exactly. Like that's a lot rarer, that kind of scenario. But like the Reach never fully conquered the West, and the West never fully conquered the Reach. Neither of those ever happened in thousands of years.
Okay, so the quote: "The boundaries of the Westerlands today follow those of the Kingdom of the Rock as it was before the Field of Fire, when King Loren Lannister, Loren the Last, knelt as a king and rose as a lord. But in bygone days, the boundaries were more fluid, particularly to the south, where the Lannisters oft contended against the Gardeners in a Reach, and to the east, where they warred against many kings of the Trident."
Right on. Yes. So, that said, there's reason to believe this particular time was one of relative peace between those powers, because they would ally to fight Aegon. So if they really hated each other, they probably wouldn't do that. They might still do it because of the expediency of it. But given that no one was really willing to ally with Argilac or Princess Maria or even mostly the Targaryens were able to pick off these kingdoms one by one. So one of the only alliances, or the only alliance really, was this West and Reach coalition. So probably now there may have been they may have been warring with Harren here and there. He may have been picking at their borders. We know for sure he was raiding to steal captives to put to work in the mines and quarries to build the castle. So he was probably going outside his territory for some of that. Nina agrees that the Gardeners and Lannisters were probably on decent terms, and of course the weakness of the Durrandon state was a reason for the Reach to be looking east rather than towards the Westerlands. If you're going to pick off some new territory, you're going to pick it from the weaker kingdom, not the stronger one. Even though Argilac was a stronger king, the Lannisters were a stronger region at this time. And of course, with the West having an unusual scenario, for most of the time, the West has been like, the Ironborn is over the bay there, and they're our biggest foe, because they're more dangerous in a lot of ways than the Reach, because the Reach is going to come overland. You can scout, you can usually see them coming. They're not as likely to sneak up on you. But the Ironborn, they can appear anywhere from sea. It's a lot harder to see that coming. So for one of the first times in their history, the Ironborn are not only still that threat, but they've got the whole Riverlands right above them. So it's just like, whoa, there's this whole they're almost surrounded by Ironborn for the only time in their history, and this has been going for about 80 years at this point. So that's a real new scenario for the West, something they've never been, thousands of years of their history, and this really hasn't been seen. Arguably, something similar to this was seen back in the really early days when the Ironborn were arguably the biggest power in Westeros. But that is a long time in the past. That is thousands of years ago. So but it's still a huge factor here to consider. It's like, when have that ever happened before? The Ironborn on your north and west? Like, yikes. And then if they keep encroaching, they'll also be to the east. It's like they're going to take Blackwater Bay and all those other. Wow, we might eventually be truly completely surrounded by the Ironborn. So that said, though, despite that, the Westerlands was still pretty closed. I mean, they still have strong borders, strong natural borders. So they probably weren't overly threatened. They needed to stay wary, but they, just for the reasons we said, it wasn't like they were in danger of being conquered. That's still the thing. They're just like, yeah, we're still Casterly Rock. We still have that going for us.
A little thought that popped in my head talking about that, the difference between the threat that the Reach and the Ironborn present, and why the Reach and the West might still be on decent terms, even if they have some conflicts. Land, towns, farms, ports, rivers, whatever that the West and the Reach might squabble over, each one in the end, they still want it to be productive. Does that make sense?
Yes.
They want the people of the town to be loyal and to generate food and tax and so on. Where the Ironborn, they don't care. They come, take everything, and leave. They don't worry about the morale of the people to leave behind. They don't care if the homes all get burnt down. They just want to get what they can right now, and then they're out of there. Where whoever ends up in control, the Lannisters or the Gardeners or whoever, when it's done, they still want that land and those people to be productive and et cetera, et cetera. So they're less likely to be as destructive or ruthless with each other or those territories or those peoples than the Ironborn would be.
You're right. And that's true even with this version of the Ironborn, who were a little more forward thinking about that sort of thing. They were less destructive because they did want to profit so that they could spend that money on building ships and more war. But they were still very brutal and exacting.
Yeah, less destructive isn't not destructive.
Exactly. They were a 9 instead of an 11 on the 10-point scale.
By the way, the IMDb page for this is Spinal Tap, the 1 to 10 rating, it goes to 11.
Does it really?
Yeah.
I love that so much. Spinal Tap is so good. All right, so let's talk about the Reach. The last known ruler, Mern the Ninth Gardener, the last Gardener King. He's going to die on the field of fire. Since I said earlier he had grandsons squiring for him on the battlefield of the field of fire, he was certainly not a young man 15 years prior to the conquest. I mean, even if you're maxing out, like you have kids at 16 and then your kids have kids at 16, which in Westeros, that could happen. You're still over 30 when you have grandkids, which is, God, that's weird to have be 32 years old and have grandkids. What the hell? But that's probably not what happened. Probably not what happened. Especially because he also has like brothers and other kids. So, but what does that say? Just as we used Shara Aaron's offer as a guideline to her personality, what does it say when you bring your whole family to battle and you're like, and he puts his heir in the vanguard? He's like, you take the position of honor here. I'm in the front. You're in the other front. We're going to go head to head with the dragon. He also tells King Loren of the West, he's like, I brought more men than you, so I get to be in the front. Loren's probably like, go right ahead. He may not have been. He may have been like,
in the briar patch. Yeah.
But still. So what does that say to you? What is this? I mean, it's kind of obvious. Like arrogance is the most obvious thing, I guess you could say. But does it say anything else beside that?
Mern's like, Argalak the arrogant, hold my beer.
Yeah, talk about
I'll
arrogant.
show you who's arrogant.
Hold my mead. Yeah.
He's got to be naive also, not just arrogant, you know.
Yeah, this guy.
He was Mern the Modest.
Mern. Maybe he hadn't fought in battles. Maybe, like as we said, maybe this was maybe a time of more relative peace because they were the Reach hadn't fought the West as much. Argalak had killed one of Mern's ancestors in battle. Maybe they weren't so eager to fight him again. Yeah, maybe Mern just wasn't experienced. Maybe Mern didn't have a lot of battle experience, and so he was just more leading. He was like a Emery Florent, the guy who led Stannis' navy at the Blackwater, where he just like charged in. He's like, who cares? Just sail right in. We've got overwhelming strength. There can't be any traps. We're not worried, you know, that kind of thing. Same result too. Got burned. Everyone got incinerated.
There could be some, you know, we're looking at this super negatively, but maybe it's not. Like maybe he was just really brave. Maybe he's really confident in his soldiers and their training and their resources.
You can be brave and stupid, yeah.
And
you can be both, yeah.
Yeah. And also maybe there's a certain amount of honor involved. Like he doesn't just consider the idea. Okay, I'm partly thinking about how like a lot of battles used to go. I'm going to say, I'm less sure about Asian history, but like in European and American centric battles, there were like organized events. Not always, but you know, that was sort of an exception in the American Revolution, this sort of guerrilla warfare that we were using, that, you know, we would like hide behind trees and run and come, you know, ambush and stuff like that. Usually they would just say, all right, 9:00 in the field, I'll meet you there. And they would like line up, you know, like clean their weapons and straighten up their uniform and get in a row, like, okay, begin the fight.
Oddly
and people
organized.
would come and watch. There would be like an audience, families, you know, would like sit on the sidelines and observe the battle. You know, this, I can imagine on some level that's what he was expecting. He was thinking it was going to be like a tournament, and his knights would go and joust with their knights, and we'll show them who the better knights are.
That is kind of
he didn't understand that a dragon was going to fly
forward,
across and burn them.
Yeah, you're right. I like comparing it to a tournament because that is like the Reach is the seat of tournaments and chivalry. So he could kind of treat it like, you'd see like some of his lesser lords are like, he's treating this like a tournament. This is serious, man. Like you can also see, I can kind of get at like what he's thinking. Like a lot of times what we see is these really high-level people or people who lose sight of the danger and the difficulty and focus on the end result and like how great it's going to be to win. He's thinking how great it's going to be for us to beat this guy that just beat Harren the Black. We beat the guy that beat Harren the Black. How awesome is that going to look for us? We're going to look so great. We're going to be the talk of the continent.
The legacy of his heir that was in the Vanguard.
Yeah, he's thinking about his whole family. He's like thinking of sharing it a little bit. Maybe there's a little bit of, he's arrogant, but he's also wants his whole family to get the glory and be like, I don't want any of them to be left out. Like the one kid that was left at home, like I wasn't included in this monumental milestone defining event of our generation that got you all killed.
Yeah. Like arrogance is a lot worse when it's not backed up. Does that make sense? Like and again, he might have also been irresponsible or naive or other stuff, but he may have genuinely had well-trained soldiers and made a point of being a good leader and training his family and treating his people well. And now's the time to prove that my leadership and my people are going to be the victors. It might have been as much from confidence and loyalty and it might not have been purely, it easily could have been just purely negative, irresponsible, but I'm just trying to allow for, because when it seems so crazy, I wonder if there's more to it than that.
Yeah. So there was also the Order of the Green Hand existed in this era. Of course, it was nearly wiped out also at the Field of Fire, except for the Manderleys. They're the only ones who still claim membership to that order that we hear of. And that would have been a big deal around this time. Maybe the Order of the Green Hand impacted Mern's plans. Maybe their agency was important. Like they decided that this is a moment for the Order of the Green Hand to their ancient beliefs symbolically standing up against this Valyrian power. Maybe that was important to them for symbolic victory. They needed to show that strength. Something like that could have been in mind. Another great power in the Reach, of course, is the Hightowers. They did not participate in the Field of Fire. They stayed out. So this probably implies that this Manfred Hightower, who was old-ish at the time of the Field of Fire, was probably the Lord of the Hightower at this time, 10 to 15 years before, 5 to 15 years before. He was probably one of these guys that maybe saw which way the wind was blowing. Maybe he realized Mern was a dummy. Maybe he realized Aegon was not. Maybe he just thought the whole thing was better to just let itself play out and not get involved. At the same token, in the same city, the High Septon, the Citadel, and the High Tower, and the seat of the Faith is right there. The High Septon that would eventually crown Aegon was probably the High Septon of this era. Maybe it was the prior one. Who knows? They don't keep last names, so it's particularly hard to keep track of them. But one of the High Septons, not long after this, was a Hightower. So there's this strong chance of the nobles and the church working together in concert to try to decide the best way to handle this new world order. And as we know, what will happen is when Aegon arrives at Old Town, he'll find the gates open and the city just like, hey, welcome, new king. Here's your table. We've got a table ready for you. Here's your waiter. I'll be taking care of you tonight. We're happy to have you here at Cafe Old Town. We've got your crown ready too. The High Septon's cleaning it off for you. We'll put it on whenever you're ready. So they were like, they played it like, yeah. Of course, by that time, Aegon had like won every battle. So they're like, yeah, we're really not going to go up against that. So it was also just like, of course you're going to surrender at this point. But still, that just goes to show we have a kind of a wise statesman, maybe a little like Torrhen Stark, this Manfred Hightower, who was like, we're not fighting that. We'll do anything we can to not fight that. Maybe we'll pretend we're considering it. But in the back of his head, he's like, I'm only pretending to look like this is an option. We're never fighting them unless they give us no choice and just like a flat out attack us. Yeah. So, we also,
yeah,
go ahead.
I wonder if Mern could also have had a religious influence. Like if he was very devout in his faith of the seven and just believed that the gods would lead him to victory.
Great point.
Often a factor.
You're right. You're absolutely right. That is something that I should have thought of, and is not an unlikely possibility. Maybe it's part of the equation. His belief that the Dragon Lords, the faith would lend strength to his arms. These Dragon Lords are, because the faith would begin preaching pretty hardcore against them after this, and it didn't just come from nowhere. The disparity in beliefs and things that they consider abomination are pretty straightforward. Incest, dragons, worshiping other gods, all this stuff. Yeah. So let's briefly mention the Tyrells, right? The Tyrells are important because they become the stewards of Highgarden. But at this era, that's what they are. They're stewards only, not High Lords yet. So, but they're going to glom onto Aegon pretty quickly and be like, yep, we're on your team. And that's going to result in rewards and difficult tasks given to them. Remember that Aegon went hawking on the Arbor early in his life, or maybe shortly after he became Lord. We're not clear when that happened, but before the conquest. So he seems to have, we mentioned earlier that he seems to have befriended the Lord of the Arbor. That may have come into play when he attacked the Reach. Normally the Arbor would be like, okay, I got to send my troops to the Overlord and send some troops to help fight Aegon. But this guy might have been like, you know what, I'm not going to send any troops. And being on an island, you can maybe get away with that. It's not like the Reach can just send a bunch of ships to attack. They are the ships that the west coast of the Reach often relies on. It's the Arbor fleet that's quite often is that power. So they would be able to sit back and expect to not have a lot of pushback. Talk about a defensible position. No one wants to wreck the Arbor. That's where all the wine comes from. Then the High Lords aren't going to destroy that. No, they've got a natural, it's like plot armor. No one wants to destroy that.
Is there, I can imagine this is a detail that just doesn't exist, but they might have legitimately not been able to for some reason if there was like storms and their ships have been wrecked or washed out.
Would be a good excuse to say, storms, man.
Sorry, we would have come, but our ships were disabled.
Yeah. And then they don't have to. Then the gardeners were wiped out. So there's like, well, we don't even have to make excuses. There's no one to make excuses to. Like, hey, we weren't in the battle. We didn't fight against you. Should we be rewarded for that? I think so. Mm-hmm. Nina writes that, the waning power of House Durrandon had meant waxing power for House Gardner. The Durrandons were distracted by the Ironborn. The Riverlands were occupied by the Ironborn. The Vale was clearly anxious about that with them, all those attacks on the Bloody Gate. So that kind of opened up a scenario where the Reach could attack the Stormlands and pick little pieces off without worrying about the other kingdoms interfering with those gains, which is usually a problem, right? The great game being as it is, none of the other kingdoms want any kingdom to gain too much power. So this is an opportunity for the Reach to gain some strength without ticking anybody else off, or at least not them being able to do much about it. Of course, with Dorne to the south as well, that's a thing. But Dorne is never an issue in terms of a threat as a conqueror. Dorne's always a threat to come and raid and steal and destroy and pillage. But Dorne has never emerged from those mountains with conquest on their mind. They just don't have the manpower or cultural connection for that. The people wouldn't accept that rule probably. So it allows them to defend that border less because they're not worried about massive armies. They're worried about raiding parties.
But even the raiding parties that might come from Dorne, they're not like a concerted effort of Dorne. They're just people on the borders where like the people of the Iron Islands get together, build ships. It's like their culture's purpose. Whereas Dorne is more split culturally in the first place.
There's some state-sanctioned raiding probably, but it would be on the down low. They wouldn't be like, we're flying the flag of Sunspear as we raid. They might actually be funded by Sunspear where they're not going to make it known.
But they're not raising armies in Sunspear, marching up to the passes to go attack the Reach. Yeah,
totally right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the Faith Militant. Yeah, so where was the Faith Militant this time? What were they doing? Well, good chance they were just penned up in Old Town. When exactly would they have gotten involved? You might be like, why didn't they get involved? But when would they have? I mean, during the conquest, like they're not going to stand up for Harren the Black, right? And they may not maybe they'd take the side of the Storm King over the Targaryens, but they wouldn't. Are they just going to send an army to him? I mean, that doesn't necessarily make sense either. So while they might be, while they are ideologically opposed to Valyrian beliefs, and that problem would arise later, especially with Maegor. At this point, they're not friendly with a lot of the other powers that are being attacked, not entirely anyway. So it's when you think about when would they have gotten involved, well, I don't know. So that is a good question. Without being able to answer that question, the answer is, well, their commander may not have thought it was time to get involved. Maybe they were organizing. Maybe there's a lot of possibilities.
Maybe they even did get involved in ways that aren't as clear, like maybe some of the Gardener's forces came from the Faith.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Maybe they were a little bit on the field of fire. Maybe they're represented there, and it's just not, the histories don't include that. But yeah, it's entirely possible. All right.
But maybe soldiers that the Faith would have sent were already called to other banners.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
And yeah.
All right, our last region for the day is Dorne, the important Dorne. Of course, Dorne wasn't taken in the conquest, so it's still important to take note of because they tried to conquer them and because Dorne is fun and interesting. Again, Princess Meria Martell, the Yellow Toad, she was about age 80 during the conquest, so she would have been 75, 65, 5 to 15 years before. Nina says, remember that the Martells have, quote, only been in power for about 700 years at this point, which is a long time for a real-world perspective, but comparing it to like the Starks, Lannisters, Durrandons, and Gardeners, or even certain Ironborn powers, that's nothing. I mean, they've been ruling for thousands of years. Even the Arryns had been in power for over 1,000 years at this point. The Martells are definitely the newcomers on the block in terms of a great house. They were also the first power to have united Dorne under a single banner, because Dorne was normally more of its own miniature microcosm of the 100 Kingdoms, where they were not united, in part, Sean, because of what you said about the different ethnic groups that were present there, and the natural barriers between a lot of the regions. The desert is a separation. The mountains are separation points. This is geographical features that separate them. So it's kind of... there's still people that wanted to, maybe overthrow them or weren't happy with them, like the Ironwoods, who have always been the greatest rivals to the Martells. Here's a quote from The World of Ice and Fire, a quick one about Meria.
Meria Martell was 80 years of age, the maesters tell us, and had ruled the Dornishmen for 60 of those years.
We have few examples, if any, of someone being in charge for that long, of any kingdom. I'm like, off the top of my head, Jaehaerys was king for about that long. But not that long. No, he lived about that long. I'm sorry, I'm wrong. He lived for like 65 years, I think, and he lived longer than that. But he became king early. He became king at like 15, and Maria, I guess she became queen or princess around age 20. But that's just a massive length to rule. You got to learn a few things there. You can't hold on to power that long without learning a few tricks, and there's other reasons to think she was pretty clever, very brave, certainly not bowed, maybe a little bent because of her age, but not broken. Not fully bent, though, that's for sure. So she did, and she also won't die till about age 93. So she's also going to live for quite a bit longer. She had probably been ruling Dorne since most of the other current rulers had even been born. So, like, really long. So she had seen a lot of them come and go. Think about that. What I mentioned at the beginning was that her mother and father were alive during the Doom. So she's seen this whole thing come full circle. She sees the Targaryens move to Dragonstone. See all this time pass, all these generations of Targaryens come, and then now they're trying to conquer Westeros. Her lifespan is placed right in the middle of that, in a positioned well to like see it and witness it throughout her life. It's a very interesting perspective.
That'd be a good spinoff. That'd be a good.
Yes. Yeah, not only an interesting person, but a very interesting time for her to have lived through. So just as an observer and as a person, yeah. And Dorne is just so interesting anyway. I mean, with the Rhoynish culture being in there and making it kind of a world apart with all their technological advantages, and Nina writes, just as the Gardeners took advantage of the declining power of the Stormlands, so the Dornish did the same. But while the Gardeners seem to have held back after Garth VII's defeat and death at Summerfield, I didn't mention that, by the way, Garth VII's defeat at Summerfield, that's Argilac. Argilac beat Garth VII at the Battle of Summerfield. That was Mern's ancestor, Garth. So continuing Nina's quote, even as the conquest was beginning, Maria Martell offered to join the Targaryens in alliance against King Argilac. Given the long history of bloodshed and violence on both sides of the Dornish marches, it's probably not surprising that the Martells will be looking to take advantage of a current state of weakness within the Durrandon Kingdom. Likewise, because the Martells only share a border with the Reach and Stormlands, they may have figured that the Whores were not a threat to them. Black Herons doesn't share a border, they're super far away, so not really worried about empowering the Whores by taking down the Durrandons, which other global powers would have wanted to maybe maintain that parity, but Dorne wouldn't have been concerned with that parity. They would be happy to be rid of their 1,000+ like multi-thousand year enemy of the Stormlanders. Her son, Prince Nymor, which is awfully similar to Prince Namor of the Submariner from Marvel Comics fame. He was 33 years younger than her. So maybe not her firstborn, but he would become her heir. And then his heir is Princess Daria, daughter of his daughter. Given how old she was, these two were probably both alive too. Daria and Nymor were probably both alive at 5 to 15 years before the conquest. And
how alive, but how old? Do you think Daria would have been aware of the events?
That I'm not so sure about. Nymor was 33 years younger than her, so he would have been already like 37. So Daria could have been a teenager by then. So decent chance she could have been aware of it. And if not, she would have been entering the age where she could have. So, and they would have been raising her to rule. This is Dorne, so they wouldn't have been like some boy could come along and jump ahead of you in the succession. But that's, in Dorne, Princess Daria, she's locked in. So that's good. So they would have raised her to rule from the get-go, and thus make her learn about politics and these world-shaping events. So yeah, I would think she's pretty aware of it. Another character just to be aware of, he's not a major name, but Joffrey Dane, Sir Joffrey Dane, will lead an army to the gates of Old Town in 10 AC and just ravage the territory. He couldn't get inside; it was too much to break down the walls or to get in, but he just laid waste to the territory. So since he's leading an army 10 years after the conquest, I mean, if he's 20 at that point, that means he's born 10 years before the conquest. He's probably older than that. If he's leading an army, we obviously do see people that young leading armies, but usually it's the senior commanders, the people who have got experience doing that sort of thing, especially something important as attacking a major target like Old Town. You don't send a teenager for that, I don't think. Not very often anyway. Another important figure is the Widow Lover, the Lord of Will, who is going to infamously inflict brutalities on the Targaryens. Some would say deserved because they were invading his homeland. And this guy will be coming back to him when we cover the conquest, but I wanted to make sure his name got thrown out because he was certainly alive at this point, probably Lord by this time. Maybe his father was still in charge, or his uncle, or whoever, his older brother. You never know the succession in cases like this. We just throw out all the quick possibilities.
On the subject of names, I wanted to point out with Maria's name, I think it can sometimes get ignored just because we're saying her name out loud. But that's Nymeria. It's Miria.
Oh, it's Miria?
Of
course, Nymeria, obviously.
It's Nymeria, like Nymor, Nymeria,
Yeah.
Miria.
Yeah.
Like, I just wanted to point that out because when we say it, Maria, I don't think that comes across.
You're right.
And in fact, it was originally transcribed by like Adam Whitehead when George originally like read from the World of Ice and Fire and stuff like that. And he said when he said it, people transcribed it as Maria, like Mariya. So clearly, however George said it, it was not like it wasn't said in a way that. So, anyways, her name has been spelled different ways because we knew about her before it was published.
Well, George pronounces.
Yeah, he said some things weird,
Well, he pronounces that word Pasquantino.
What?
Yeah.
I don't know what words you're saying.
Maria. He says he pronounces Maria Pasquantino.
Oh, I see.
He pronounces
that's why
Nymeria.
the spelling is
Yeah,
confusing.
Nymeria he pronounces Pasquantino.
But yeah, and so then of course when you have Daria, that's another spin on Nymeria, and Maria, it's just that same
Yeah, the original Nymeria had a younger sister named Nyderia. So.
Nymeria.
Just kidding. So, yeah, summarizing the realm as a whole, if we could do a quick 2 minutes on all the kingdoms together and what the outlook was at this point of view, not much unity. You can see why it was somewhat ripe for conquest, even though that was kind of a normal state of affairs. They're always just make sure no one gets too powerful and keep your entrenched power in place so that no matter what happens, it's hard to push you out of power. It's true for the Lannisters, true for the Gardeners, true for the Storm Kings, true all around for all these great powers. That point was approaching with Harren. Harren the Black was tipping the scales, being like, we might have to gang up on this guy. That's, if we're looking at what if scenarios, we briefly touched on that earlier, that would have probably been what happened. It would have been a reckoning. Other kings would have been like, are we going to team up on this guy, or is he going to pick us off one by one, or is his kingdom going to collapse because of his harsh style of rule? I wonder if some of them were just hoping that would happen. They would just let it go. Let him collapse on his own. We don't have to do anything about it. But they could have been wrong. It may have still taken several more generations. So, yes, world building, many possibilities.
I don't know. I never thought of it from this perspective before. To me, in the past, always the idea that Aegon built down Harren Hall right after they finished building it. Oh, the irony. But I started to think, wait, he didn't just happen to show up right when I wonder why. Why didn't he do it before it got built?
Well, he was probably maybe the timing wasn't great, but yeah, maybe it would have been better to do it a little bit before. But of course, it didn't even end up mattering. The completion of the castle wasn't really that relevant. Because he could easily go over the defenses.
I wonder if he specifically was waiting for it to be done to make more of a statement.
That's a great idea.
All right, we're in 3 weeks. They should be done. Make sure the dragons are fed. Get the troops ready to go.
Some work, too.
That's a great idea, because people are like, oh, too much of a coincidence. And people, the history's just written that way to make it seem symbolic. But you're right. He might have been waiting because it looks he not. It's like the prison thing. When you go to prison, you attack someone else so that you don't look weak. And if the bigger the person you attack, the stronger you look. So Aegon starts off by going after the biggest dog in the kennel, and he waited till he looked even stronger. So it just shows how strong he's. Yeah, I'm gonna make. They all don't, and especially given the general confusion over just how powerful a dragon is at this era. He knew, but the other kings didn't. The other commoners didn't exactly know. He made sure they knew. But it's you're right. I think it wasn't clear that they understood what they were getting into, because they hadn't seen dragons in action.
Waiting for Harren Hall to be done and then burning it down makes his point.
I like that idea a lot. Yeah, because it's the same thing. That's basically the same point I was trying to make at the Field of Fire, that he intentionally brought fewer men so people would be like, the dragons did that. It's the same thing you're saying with this castle. The dragons did that. You don't fight back against this guy. He's got an insurmountable advantage. Not only does he have dragons, he's got one of the biggest dragons ever, if not the biggest dragon ever. It's possible Balerion was the biggest dragon in thousands of years or something. I don't know. Question from Will Moss. Populations have dropped in many places and times in the past. After the Black Death, the population of England dropped massively, and it took centuries to rebuild to pre-plague levels. Spring sickness is an example in world. Yeah, that's true. I don't think Sean was saying that it's just a straight line up, but there's always there could be setbacks. But generally speaking, compare the world in 100 and 1,000-year blocks, it's almost always going up.
Yes, but
my
point remains. I brought up the Great Spring Sickness and stuff like that is why the North might have been more populous than they are now, and so thanks, Will.
That's true. That is true. That would have, just to be clear, the Great Spring Sickness was around the year 210, which 90 years prior to the the books.
So, like that's a generation lost or something,
Yeah, that has a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, like all the kids aren't having kids. Yeah, it takes a long time to rebuild a population. It takes generations to rebuild from that. So this is a great point. Yeah. Dornish James says, Torrhen could have anticipated Harren wanting to expand north or been offended by Harren burning so much weirwood. Yeah, as another person, we talked about this, maybe the supernatural elements being upset with the weirwood burning. But yeah, the Northerners would have been probably too. That's a good point. I was only thinking of the supernatural, but yeah, like a lot of Starks would be like, hey, don't do that. So yeah, that's a great angle to consider.
So yeah, then Torrhen was just prepared when Aegon landed.
Yeah, he's like, this guy's just burning down weirwoods. We're gonna get our armies ready to deal with this guy.
And then he's like, oh wait, there's another more important guy to deal with.
They can pretend they were prepared for the dragons, but they're preparing for either one. Whatever. Either way, they're getting their army ready. It's not like they have fireproof suits to wear in either case. It's the same preparation.
I wonder some, I don't know, Stannis or the realm's preparation for the others might also be good preparation for Euron.
Oh yeah, definitely preparing for war.
Or and conversely, there's also Stannis or whatever's preparation to fight the Lannisters prepared him to go up north and fight the others.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Same,
perfect.
The same kind of idea.
That is true.
If Stannis hadn't had forces rallied and equipped and such to war for the throne, then he wouldn't have had them ready to war against the others either. Yeah.
Right on. Okay, trivia question. Who died in the infamous bed of scorpions? As I said, we heard his house in A Song of Ice and Fire and had his full name clarified in The World of Ice and Fire. The name is Lionel Tyrell.
Can anyone tell me who plays Lionel Tyrell on Michael Klarfeld's Dorne map? It's someone in the fandom that we all know. Someone we've had on our episodes, on our streams, plays.
I feel like I should know.
Yeah, Sean should know. If anyone guesses, we'll see if anyone says it, but I'll say it in a minute otherwise.
While you're pondering, I'll throw out a little tidbit. Nina mentioned that we might actually get to see Lionel Tyrell, this character, pre-Scorpions, in young toddler or baby form in House of the Dragon, because that's his era. He would have been born in the House of the Dragon era. The actual incident would have been in the year, I think, 157 or 158 would have been, or maybe, in that region. The Conquest of Dorne was like 157, 158, and then it was fully free again by 161. So that's your time frame on that.
You ready for your answer?
Yeah, what's the answer to your question, Ashaya?
Jeff Hartline, Brendan Beefish,
plays Brendan Beefish.
Lionel Tyrell. Yep.
That's right.
he's lying there shirtless, naked or whatever, covered in scorpions and dead. So if you ever wanted to see him dead.
And isn't there a woman in that shot?
There is a woman, but it's not a woman we know.
Oh, it's just a random woman. Okay, it's not a model, fandom model.
No, it's not a fandom model. It's a nude woman. So
I guess he couldn't get someone
display, to. So. I mean, he did, but then he didn't use it anyways. There was Jasmine was going to be it, but he decided to go a different direction, and he changed Jasmine to Nymeria.
Oh, wow. She came out. She came out fine.
She came out ahead there.
From random sex worker to Nymeria. Yeah, all right. That's cool. So other episodes we mentioned in this episode, I recommend our Balerion episode. It fills in a little more detail pre-Doom and about some of the other Targaryen figures, while also going through the rest of Balerion's life and times. The Lost Valyrian Steel episode with Tommy Pappas has some tidbits that are relevant to this one, especially Tommen the Second Lannister, as well as some other stuff about just the Targaryens and Valyrian Steel in general. Gogossos, we mentioned that really early on, the 10th Free City, the one that was wiped out by the Red Death. That is a patrons-only episode, bonus episode. And that one delves deep into another era of time with blood magic and sorcery and weird creature experiments and very role-playing-ish setting. It's a fun episode, so check that out if you're so inclined. Our patron voters chose the Red Kings for our next topic. The Red Kings, that's the Kings of the Dreadfort. Oh, we've covered other areas of the north, the Barrow Kings, the Starks of Winterfell, obviously, the Wall, the other related topics. So we'll cover the eastern side of the north. Well, we've covered the Manderleys too, so this is probably the biggest one that we have yet to cover in the north. Not the last one, but the biggest remaining probably. or at least one of. It beat Dragonstone, the topic Dragonstone, by 1 vote. So that was a close call there. The Free City of Lys, however you say it, and House Tarly were the other things that were voted on. So those did not win. Thanks again to Stephen Atwell. His Race for the Iron Throne blog was very helpful to some of the points today. We'll hopefully have him back on again sometime. Thanks to anyone who came live and hung out with us today for a nice lengthy episode. 2 weeks in a row of pretty long episodes. Thanks as well to Nina for her invaluable assistance. A lot of great takes again today. Check out goodqueenalley.tumblr.com. If you are a patron of History of Westeros, or one of a subscriber on Anchor Spotify, or someone who's donated before in the past, we very much appreciate that. You, of course, are eligible to vote in our polls if you're on Patreon and get all our bonus episodes if you're on any of those platforms. So, good time to join right before House of the Dragon gets fired up. Things are heating up. Joey, Jesse, and Kevin, and Michael, thank you guys for your music and artwork. So awesome to have. It really makes things look better. Makes us all look fancier and cooler. And thanks, of course, as well to our mods on Facebook and Discord. Those are our main spots these days. Y'all keeping things smooth and clean over there. Great discussions, great times. And that's about to heat up as well, even more because of the new content coming. Our good friends over at Here Be Dragons are talking about Stranger Things Volume 2, Part 2. Working their way through the Stranger Things catalog, it would seem. And, of course, here's a reminder that Ashay and I will be at San Diego Comic-Con near the end of July. If you're going to be there, let us know, and we'll be coming back with some reports.
Yeah, let us know whether you're going to be at San Diego Comic-Con or whether you just live in the San Diego area, because there will be an off-site activation for House of the Dragon, the Dragon's Den. So even if you don't have a badge for San Diego Comic-Con, and you live in the area, you should absolutely come out and go to the Dragon's Den. We'll be there.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out today. We'll be back next week with the Red Kings. And until then, you know what to do. Valar Rereadis.